The Thom Hartmann Program is brought to you in part by the Aiden Forecast, an investment newsletter with weekly updates of leading market indicators and a monthly deep dive into what the details of the economy and the markets mean for investors and retirees. On the web at aidenmarkets.com.
Wines have some of the highest pesticide levels in our food chain. This hour brought to you by ecowine.com. Pesticide-free wines, organic wines, imported from France by the Organic Wine Company, ecowine.com.
The Thom Hartmann Program is brought to you in part by Super Beets. Super Beets are sourced from non-GMO beets, and they're packed with dietary nitrates, helping to produce nitric oxide for more energy, stamina, and support for healthy blood pressure levels naturally.
Call 800-568-9889 or go to thomsbeets.com. That's 800-568-9889, Thom's Beets, THOMSBEETS.com.
It's the Thom Hartmann University Book Club. Today we're reading from Unequal Protection, How Corporations Became People and How You Can Fight Back by Thom Hartmann. This is from the introduction titled The Battle to Save Democracy. Excuse me. On September 2nd, 2009, the transnational pharmaceutical giant Pfizer pled guilty to multiple criminal felonies. It had been marketing drugs in a way that may well have led to the deaths of people, and that definitely led physicians to prescribe and patients to use pharmaceuticals in a way that for which they were not intended. Because Pfizer is a corporation, a legal abstraction, really, it couldn't go to jail like fraudster Bernie Madoff or killer John Dillinger. Instead, it paid a $1.2 billion criminal fine to the U.S. government, the biggest in history, as well as an additional $1 billion in civil penalties. The total settlement was more than $2.3 billion, another record. None of Pfizer's executives, decision makers, stockholders, owners, or employees saw even 5 minutes of the inside of a police station or a jail. Most Americans don't even know about this huge and massive crime, nor do they know that the criminal never spent a day in jail. But they do know that in the autumn of 2004, Martha Stewart was convicted of lying to investigators about her sale of stock in another pharmaceutical company. Her crime cost nobody their life, but she famously was escorted off to a women's prison. Had she been a corporation instead of a human being, odds are there would not have even been an investigation. Yet over the past century, and particularly the past 40 years, corporations have repeatedly asserted that they are, in fact, persons, and therefore eligible for the human rights protections of the Bill of Rights. In 2009, the right-wing advocacy group Citizens United argued before the Supreme Court that they had the First Amendment right to free speech and to influence elections through the production and distribution of a slasher documentary designed to destroy Hillary Clinton's ability to win the Democratic nomination. Some political observers assert that they did this in part because they believed that a black man whose first name sounded like Osama and whose middle name was Hussein could never, ever possibly win against a Republican, no matter how poor a candidate they put up. In that, they were following on a 2003 case before the Supreme Court in which Nike claimed it had the First Amendment right to lie in its corporate marketing, a variation of the First Amendment right of free speech. Corporations haven't limited their grasp to the First Amendment. Pretty much any and virtually every amendment that could be used to further corporate interests has been fair game. As you'll learn in this book, in previous decades, a chemical company took to the Supreme Court a case asserting its Fourth Amendment right to privacy from the EPA, snooping into its illegal chemical discharges. Other corporations have asserted Fifth Amendment rights against self-incrimination, as well as asserting the 14th Amendment, passed after the Civil War to strip slavery from the Constitution, asserting that it protects their right against discrimination by a local community that doesn't want them building a toxic waste incinerator, commercial hog operations, or superstores. If this trend continues, it's probably just a matter of time before a corporation claims the Second Amendment right to bear arms anywhere, anytime, and your credit card company's bill collector shows up at your home with a sidearm. This legal situation is not only bizarre, but also quite the opposite of the visions for this country held by the founders of the nation and the framers of the Constitution. They were sufficiently worried about corporate power that they didn't even include in the Constitution the word corporation, intending instead that the states should tightly regulate corporate behavior which the states did quite well until just after the Civil War. The American Revolution, you'll learn in this book, was in fact provoked by the misbehavior of a British corporation. Our nation was founded in an anti-corporate power fury. The most significant and oft-quoted precedent of the turning point of corporate power in America began just after the Civil War. It rested on a constitutional amendment successfully written and passed by a group of radical Republicans after the Civil War. That's what they called themselves, radical Republicans, to take slavery out of the Constitution. Given that today's Republican Party has, largely since the robber baron era of the 1880s, been the party of big business and the very rich, it's a bit difficult for some people to get their minds around the possibility that the Republican Party started out as a reform party, that for nearly 70 years, from before Abraham Lincoln until just after Theodore Roosevelt left the party to start a third party, had a strong progressive wing. But the Republican Party did. Although Lincoln was, by today's standards, a moderate Republican, he was still anti-slavery, pro-middle class, and pro-labor. In fact, he famously said labor is superior to capital because it precedes capital. Nobody has wealth until somebody makes something. And he was the first president both to use the word strike in public and to actually stop police and private armies from killing and beating strikers. And just like in today's mainstream Democratic Party, where there's a progressive minority that always seems to be pushing the edges, in the Republican Party of the 1800s, there was a very, even by today's standards, progressive faction. The radical Republicans were a splinter group that emerged in a big way from the Republican Party at its founding in 1854. And just after the Civil War in 1866, they gained a majority among Republicans in the House of Representatives, where they had a powerful influence until the faction disintegrated in the 1870s during the presidency of Ulysses S. Grant. They supported the absolute right of freed slaves to vote and participate in government. It goes on from there. Unequal protection.
The Thom Hartmann Program.
Greetings, my friends, patriots, lovers of democracy, truth, and justice, believers in peace, freedom, and the American way. Thom Hartmann here with you. It is Wednesday, the first hour of our program. I'll be with you all day today, by the way. Thank you to Jefferson Smith for filling in for me yesterday and Monday in the second and third hour of our program so that my voice could recover and throat and lungs and all that stuff. I think I'm pretty much put back together. So anyhow, it's the first hour of our Wednesday program, which means it's time for Middays with Mark, Congressman Mark Pocan, the co-chair of the Congressional Progressive Caucus, representing Wisconsin in the U.S. House of Representatives, Wisconsin's 2nd District. And also, you can find his website at Pocan, Pocan.house.gov, and you can tweet him at Rep. Mark Pocan. Congressman, welcome back.
Hey, thanks, Tom. You sound great, too.
Thank you. Yeah, I'm well recovered. Louise has been making lemon honey garlic for me, and just I'm wolfing the stuff down, so I've got frightening bad breath, but I'm feeling a lot better. So we had
Louise.
She's good at it, though. She really knows. Anyway, Arizona had an election yesterday, and over on Fox News, it's big news. Republicans are winning again.
Yeah, I think they're desperately trying to spin this one, and I just want people to be very clear. I mean, this was a deep red district. This was maroon. This was burgundy. This was anything but your traditional kind of marginal district. I believe Donald Trump won by 21 points, and I believe the former Republican who held the seat won by 37 points. And this time they won it by somewhere between 5 and 6 points. So once again, we're seeing this huge shift. This wasn't one that we were really saying, gee, we think it's in our grasp, as you look at it, but we saw the momentum, and we're seeing that. Also, there was a special election in New York in a state assembly seat, and the Democrat won with 59% of the vote, and it's been in Republican control since 1978.
Whoa.
So we're still seeing the momentum, and doesn't mean you're going to pick up every seat because, something that the previous person won by 37 points, I mean, clearly that's a big, big gap to make up. But now if it just became a 5 or 6 pointer, if I was a Republican in a +5 or a +10 district, I would be very, very nervous. And what we're seeing is that momentum continuing. So it was a very positive sign. While, of course, you want to win every race, it's because of gerrymandering, it's not possible. But we're seeing a real strong momentum, and that between New York and Arizona, both sides of the country yesterday, seeing the exact same result.
Yeah. And Ronnie Jackson, the admiral who serves as the doctor to Obama in the last couple of years of his presidency and to Trump, having some problems right now. It seems like this is a classic example of Trump's impulsive behavior leading to disaster.
Well, and with friends like Donald Trump, who needs enemies, right? I mean, supposedly, this is his pick. He's the doctor who told him he'd live to 200 with his genes, and all these other things that he told him that were, perfect for someone who's a narcissist like Donald Trump. To hear, he loved hearing all that, pointed at him. But now that there's, a little bit of wavy water, suddenly he's like, well, I don't know why he'd want to go through this, but I'm not going to pull his name. That's not exactly the moral courage or the support you want from the person who's appointing you. And, this, too, may very likely go down. And once again, Donald Trump, I mean, if that's how he treats his friends and he does all these other signals that he's been working on to try to, make plenty of signs that he can pardon people and everything else with all the troubles he's having, it's just a continuation of this train wreck that's known as the Trump administration. And, I feel bad because this person, I think, was a doctor that has served people and, probably is a good doctor. But to somehow think that you're going to put him in charge of one of the largest federal agencies out there and now not be there to support him, it really, I think, left people hanging again and shows that Donald Trump takes care of one person, Donald Trump.
Yeah, yeah. And by the way, I should add, for our listeners, Congressman Pocan is here with us for the hour. If you have questions for him, he will be taking your calls as soon as I'm done with him. 202-808-9925 is the phone number. Mick Mulvaney, this is amazing. Over in Think Progress, they're reporting that there is no mention of this on Fox News' website, and as of 10 a.m. this morning, no mention on Fox News itself. While Fox and Friends did Melania Trump's fashion, anti-cop celebrities, teacher with a political agenda, Fox News interns, but no discussion of the fact that Mick Mulvaney basically admitted that while he was a congressman, he took bribes and regularly and routinely violated the Honest Services Act, which is used to prosecute public officials, elected officials, for taking money in exchange for particular behavior. This guy should be in prison, shouldn't he?
Well, first, I mean, to Fox, remember the old show, Hogan's Heroes?
Yeah.
Sergeant Schultz, he knew nothing
Yeah,
all the time.
I know nothing.
Yeah, that's where Fox is at right now, right? They're not going to accept any of this. But two fronts that I think they're important on this, Tom. One, I mean, first of all, just outrageous, but also, the fact that you've got someone advising the bank lobby that they have to give more money because that's how his office operated. And, he, as you said, might have violated a number of laws in doing so. But just this idea that the only way you get access to a member of Congress is to pay something. It's long why I've said that the only real lobbyists we have in Washington, D.C. for the middle class, for the working families across this country has been organized labor. Otherwise it's every little special interest, and this is exactly what Mick Mulvaney was saying. But secondly, there is a growing trend. One of the things the Progressive Caucus did recently was we announced that we're the first major PAC to not take any corporate money. We're not going to take corporate dollars whatsoever. And there's a growing number of candidates who are starting to say that as well. And I am now hearing on a weekly basis lobbyists are nervous that if this becomes a reality, they think that somehow it's going to affect their ability to have sway over members of Congress. Go figure. And there's a real worry in D.C. around this. So I hope that this gets a lot more attention because, one of the major ways you're going to fix Washington, one is you change the faces of people who are here, but two, you change the way we fund campaigns. Because as long as we have a system like this, you're going to have people like Mick Mulvaney who are going to say that's the people who get access and no one else. Yeah.
Oh, man. Well, we got a bunch of callers here who want to mix it up with you, so let's get right to it. Brad in Elk Grove Village, Illinois, listening to WCPT out of Chicago. Brad, you're on with Congressman Pocan.
Yes. My main question will come after the first statement, and Debbie Lesko is a horrible human being. She hates education. I lived out in Arizona, moved back to Illinois, and my main point, though, is has anyone spoken to the idea that Donald Trump's intent by demanding a personal loyalty oath is to commit obstruction of justice by subverting the oath of office that everyone takes in government to defend and protect the Constitution by having your loyalty to Donald Trump as opposed to the United States.
Great point, Brad. I mean, I think the way he's doing it, he's not saying you have to choose one over the other or doing it in a very official capacity, but just the idea that this is what he has done to people, right? And we've heard this now over and over, that he personally thinks somehow that, it's kind of this like emperor mentality rather than a president mentality that is special about him and they have to have their loyalty. I don't know if you can point to much else other than the fact that he's doing this, and now it is part of the conversations around obstruction of justice and part of what the Mueller investigation is looking at. I think that alone says we're moving on that direction. But you're right, Brad, that just the idea that you should be loyal to our country first and last, and that the president shouldn't have some personal loyalty oath that supersedes it.
Yeah, it tells you everything you need to know about this administration.
Exactly.
Congressman Mark Pocan taking your calls. It's Middays with Mark.
This is the Thom Hartmann Program.
We'll be back with more of your calls. Ask a Congressman Day here. Congressman Mark Pocan taking your calls for the hour. We'll be right back. And welcome back. Dion in Round Lake, Illinois, you are on the air with Congressman Pocan.
Thanks, Tom, for letting me on the air and not letting me take a loyalty pledge.
Okay. What's up, Dion?
Yeah, my question for Congressman Pocan. I live in the county next to you in Illinois, Lake County, and I wanted to know what can I do to help support, I believe it was Chuck Schumer, to decriminalize marijuana and hopefully legalize hemp oil as well.
Yeah, I'll tell you, Dion, I just think, wherever you see the chance to support any initiatives or candidates that support your position, do so. I have to admit, I was surprised. I've been a long supporter of medical marijuana in the legislature. I support making it legal across the country. This has been a strange fight we've had, and what it's done to our prison system and everything else to families because of that has been horrendous. But one of the things that really surprised me, Dion and Tom, is in Wisconsin, we right now have a gubernatorial primary with like 16 people in Wisconsin. We'll see who all files by the end of May. But we've got a lot of candidates. And to the person right now, they all are supporting the legalization of marijuana. And, that wouldn't have been true.
Recreational?
Recreational, yes.
Whoa.
I know. And I was shocked when in fact, I had to have someone repeat it and verify it.
These are all Democrats, and you're talking about in the Democratic primary.
But the fact that wasn't even when I left the legislature 6 years ago, there were very few of us who were in the decriminalization.
Well, look at how quickly
mode.
Gay marriage flipped. I mean,
exactly.
It's like
all of a sudden,
we're hitting cultural and political tipping points. Forgive my interruption.
Yeah. No, absolutely. So Dion, I mean, that's my encouragement is make sure that those who support you on issues are supported as you move into an election cycle and support any initiatives. I hear that there may be some of those coming up in Wisconsin as well. So I think it's just one of those opportunities where, support with your feet and any other support you can give to those issues. And we're moving in the right direction on this. And again, I was shocked to see how fast it's moved in my state of Wisconsin. And that's a very positive sign.
We're just 20 seconds out from the break, Congressman. Do you think that there's any chance that at the federal level they're going to do away with this Schedule I craziness?
The problem is most recently the conversations are having a new Schedule I definition that allows research, and I don't find that at all to be the right answer. Marijuana should never be on a Schedule I, and I think we have to be very careful before we put anything on Schedule I, and I think they have a tendency to go a little quickly.
Yeah. Oh, I was wrong on my time cue. We still have 40 seconds. Schedule I, just for so people know. Can you explain what Schedules 1, 2, 3, and 4 are so that people understand this?
I don't know if I'm going to do a great job of that, Tom, but I can tell you Schedule 1 is the most severe category of any kind of drugs. It's your opioids.
Right.
It's the most serious, and yet marijuana somehow was included in Schedule 1. And given the fact that not only is medical marijuana legal in many states across the country, and we have outright legalization now in a growing number of states, it's completely illogical. And it takes away your ability to really do research on the medical and other benefits of something when it becomes Schedule 1. So it's a dangerous classification for many reasons, and things like marijuana, and they're trying to move kratom and other things into Schedule 1 right now. We've got to also stop those from happening.
Yeah, and I think Schedule 1 explicitly says it has no redeeming value, no medical value whatsoever, and therefore
and
must
if
be
you
banned.
never allow research, you're going to make sure that continues.
That's right, yeah. Congressman Mark Pocan taking your calls for the hour. We'll be back with more of Middays with Mark on the Thom Hartmann Program. Mark here on the Thom Hartmann. Middays with Mark here on the Thom Hartmann Program. Congressman Mark Pocan taking your calls for the hour. Leslie in Central Square, New York. You are on the air with Congressman Pocan.
Hi, Congressman.
Hi, Leslie.
This is a real big deal that I'm going to talk about here. They got a bill coming up that they want to have an endless war, right? Endless war bill from they want to put.
You're talking about the replacement for the AUMF that's being proposed?
Yeah. Whatever it is, endless war, okay? Now, Mr. Colburn, the retired, he put a hold on something neither party liked, and they had to wait till he retired to get rid of it, right?
No, a hold lasts for one year.
It only lasts a year?
In the Senate, I believe.
Hey, a year is a year.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure that's what Bernie told us. What's the question, Leslie?
Well, any bill that goes against the Constitution, the American people, should be a hold just like that, and you make that person a hero by running ads.
Okay.
Both parties are not for this endless war.
Leslie, I didn't hear a question there. Congressman, do you want to comment on that?
Yeah, I think I just say that, Leslie's correct. There is a proposal that's been put out for a new authorization, a new AUMF, to replace the one that came in after 9/11. Many of us have argued, mainly Democrats, but also Republicans, that, we need to have a new authorization that doesn't leave it so open-ended. It's been abused, I think, by all presidents since 9/11 because they don't have to work with Congress. They're always more than happy to not have to, but the Constitution says that we have to be involved unless it's in, act of self-defense that we're getting involved. And the presidents are just abusing it. So many of us have argued that we need a new AUMF. The problem is the new one that's been proposed in the Senate is still very loose and open-ended and will likely continue to be misused by presidents. And so the Progressive Caucus has taken a statement opposing that AUMF. We want one that Barbara Lee has been fighting to work on and quite honestly gaining some bipartisan support. But Paul Ryan stopped our ability a few months back when there was almost unanimous vote to have that action happen through the appropriations process. but we have to have something that doesn't allow a blank check, and that's what's happening right now.
Yeah. Shelby in Tallahassee, Florida. Hey, Shelby, you're on the air with Congressman Pocan.
Yes, thank you so very much, Tom, for your commentary. The previous programming that you had the couple of days ago, I'm an everyday listener for you, and I think that you're really one of our leading moral and intellectual leaders that we have right now in the progressive movement. I also wanted to thank the Congressman for the progressive caucus agenda that he is working on. Here in Florida, we're in the, I was talking about the debate you had on race and the history of race and how it impacts the modern policy arena that we now are living in. I marvel at, Macron just gave a speech to the country also, and I thought that he seemed to have brought forward that structural history to them as well. The intersection of the media saying, the intersection of policy and messaging is something that it seems is the constant gripe against the Democratic Party, and yet we've had only a 40-year messaging of less government, less tax, less regulation.
Shelby, excuse me, we have less than 50 seconds for Congressman Pocan's answer to your question.
And to your, I wanted to, if you would comment on the intersection of the messaging and policy for the Democratic Party and how that is going to impact the success for our agenda.
Thank you, Shelby.
Sure. In the limited time I have, Shelby, I think you make a strong point, which is I think the Democrats all too often haven't had as succinct and articulate as of a short message that the Republicans do. They seem to be very sophisticated in that less government, less taxes, very clear, simple, easy message, even though it doesn't really impact in a positive way the majority of Americans. We have a tendency to have very long agendas, and we don't put it more clearly. That's something we're working on for this fall. Currently, there's a better deal proposal. Some of us would prefer it would be a little bit stronger. We think that based on polling we've done, people want bold action, not incremental. And I think the more we can show people that we get it, that we're with them, we are going to be a lot better off. So your point on messaging is very, very well taken.
Somehow I got faked out by my clock again. We've got 40 seconds.
Oh, okay.
I'm sorry. So, it's not enough time to put a caller on, but, the Republicans rely heavily on Frank Luntz, and people like Frank Luntz to come up with their messaging. And, there are a few people out there who have written books about this and spoken at some length about it. I wrote a book called Cracking the Code back in 2008 about how Democrats can message. George Lakoff, famously, don't think of an elephant. Are the Democrats, employing these sorts of perspectives?
I think more than I've seen since I've been in Congress. This is my third session. They've done some polling. They understand it's an economic core message that's going to move them forward. The problem is, for some of us, a better deal isn't quite as bold as we would like. Yeah, and we're having some conversations on that.
We would like the real deal, please.
Yes, exactly.
Thank you. Congressman Mark Pocan with us, taking your calls for the hour as I'm learning how to read a clock here. We will be back with more of your calls, and my apologies to Shelby for cutting her off. We'll be right back with more of your calls for Congressman Pocan.
You're listening to the Thom Hartmann Program. Call 202-808-9925.
Middays with Mark. You can check out his website at pocan.house.gov. Today we're reading in Thom Hartmann University Book Club from How to Stop Worrying and Start Living, Time-Tested Methods for Conquering Worry by Dale Carnegie, perhaps an appropriate book in the era of Trump. This is from Chapter 2, a magic formula for solving worry situations. Would you like a quick, surefire recipe for handling worry situations? A technique you can start using right away before you go any further in reading this book? Then let me tell you about the method worked out by Willis H. Carrier, the brilliant engineer who launched the air conditioning industry and who headed the world-famous Carrier Corporation out of Syracuse, New York. It is one of the best techniques I've ever heard of for solving worry problems, and I got it from Mr. Carrier personally when we were having lunch together one day at the Engineers Club in New York. When I was a young man, Mr. Carrier said, I worked for the Buffalo Forge Company in Buffalo, New York. I was handed the assignment of installing a gas cleaning device in the plant of the Pittsburgh Plate Glass Company at Crystal City, Missouri, a plant costing millions of dollars. The purpose of this installation was to remove the impurities from the gas so it could be burned without injuring the engines. This method of cleaning gas was new. It had been tried only once before and under different conditions. In my work at Crystal City, Missouri, unforeseen difficulties arose. It worked after a fashion, but not well enough to meet the guarantee we had made. I was stunned by my failure. It was almost as if someone had struck me a blow on the head. My stomach, my insides began to twist and turn. For a while, I was so worried I couldn't sleep. Finally, common sense reminded me that worry wasn't getting me anywhere. So I figured out a way to handle my problem without worrying. It worked superbly. I've been using the same anti-worry technique for more than 30 years. It is simple. Anyone can use it. It consists of 3 steps. Step 1. I analyzed the situation fearlessly and honestly and figured out what was the worst that could possibly happen as a result of this failure. No one was going to jail me or shoot me, that was certain. True, there was also a chance that I could lose my job, and there was also a chance that my employers would have to remove the machinery and lose the $20,000 we had invested. Step 2. After figuring out what was the worst that could possibly happen, I reconciled myself to accepting it, if necessary. I said to myself, this failure will be a blow to my record and it might possibly mean the loss of my job. But if it does, I can always get another position. Conditions could be much worse, and as far as my employers are concerned, well, they realize that we're experimenting with a new method of cleaning gas, and if this experience costs them $20,000, they can stand it. They can charge it up to research, for it is an experiment. After discovering the worst that could possibly happen and reconciling myself to accepting it, if necessary, an extremely important thing happened. I immediately relaxed and felt a sense of peace that I hadn't experienced in days. Step 3. From that time on, I calmly devoted my time and energy to trying to improve upon the worst which I had already accepted mentally. I now tried to figure out ways and means by which I might reduce the loss of $20,000 that we faced. I made several steps and finally figured out that if we spent another $5,000 for additional equipment, our problem would be solved. We did this, and instead of the firm losing $20,000, we made $15,000. I probably would never have been able to do this if I had kept on worrying, because one of the worst features about worrying is that it destroys the mind's ability to concentrate. When we worry, our minds jump here and there and everywhere, and we lose all power of decision. However, when we force ourselves to face the worst and accept it mentally, we then eliminate all these vague imaginings and put ourselves in a position where we are able to concentrate on our problem in the here and now. This incident that I have related occurred many years ago. It worked so superbly that I've been using it ever since, and as a result, my life has been almost completely free from worry. End of quote. Now, why is Willis H. Carrier's magic formula so valuable and so practical, psychologically speaking? Because it yanks us down out of the great gray clouds in which we fumble around when we are blinded by worry. It plants our feet good and solid on the earth. We know where we stand, and if we can't have solid ground under us, how in creation can we ever hope to think anything through? Professor William James, the father of applied psychology, has been dead since 1910, but if he were alive today and could hear this formula for facing the worst, he would heartily approve. How do I know? Because he told his own students, quote, "Be willing to have it so. Be willing to have it so," he said, because acceptance of what has happened is the first step in overcoming the consequences of any misfortune, end quote. The same idea is expressed by Lin Yutang in his widely read book, The Importance of Living. True peace of mind, says this Chinese philosopher, comes from accepting the worst. Psychologically, I think it means the release of energy. That's it exactly. Psychologically, it means a new release of energy. When we have accepted the worst, we have nothing more to lose. And that automatically means we have everything to gain. After facing the worst, Willis H. Carrier reported, I immediately relaxed and felt a sense of peace I hadn't experienced in days. From that time on, I was able to think. Makes sense, doesn't it? Yet millions of people have wrecked their lives in angry turmoil because they refused to accept the worst, refused to improve upon it, refused to salvage what they could from the wreck. Instead of trying to reconstruct their fortunes, they engaged in a bitter and violent contest of experience and ended up victims of that brooding fixation known as melancholia. Would you like to see how someone else adopted Willis H. Carrier's magic formula and applied it to his own problem? Well, here's one example from a New York oil dealer who was a student in my classes. I was being blackmailed, the student began. I didn't believe it was possible. I didn't believe it could happen outside the movies, but I was actually being blackmailed. And, you know, he goes on with the story. It's a fascinating one. How to Stop Worrying and Start Living by Dale Carnegie. It's Middays with Mark here on the Thom Hartmann Program. Welcome back. And Congressman Mark Pocan taking your calls for the hour. Devon in Washington, D.C. Hey, Devon, you're on the air with Congressman Pocan.
Thanks so much. Hey, Congressman, I see that you co-sponsored H.R. 1227, the End Prohibition of Marijuana Act, a federal end to the Prohibition of Marijuana Act. And from what I can see, it really would just treat marijuana, cannabis like alcohol. Alcohol is not scheduled, neither is caffeine. So it seems like the most direct route to solve this problem of the federal government intervening in the states' rights to, regulate the herb in their own way is just to take it off of the list permanently. So it looks like you're the only representative in the state of Wisconsin so far who's signed on. And I just want to encourage everyone to look at H.R. 1227 and find whether or not your congressperson is supporting this really critical legislation. And if not, get on the horn. And if so, also give them a call to say thanks. But Congressman Pocan, can you tell me, am I right about that? Would it just really get to the nub of the issue in the fastest way possible to free up the states to do their own thing without interference?
No, absolutely. I mean, there are a number of pieces of legislation that have been introduced to try to address the incredibly inept way that we deal with marijuana in this country, that being one of the major pieces of legislation. And like I mentioned, the fact that in Wisconsin, every single Democrat running for governor right now has taken a legalization position shows how fast this issue is moving. And we know it based on the states that have either legalized marijuana or at minimum medical marijuana. We just need to keep being active on this issue, and I think, a legislative solution could happen, not with this majority perhaps, but with the way that we're seeing more and more people support this in, like I said, a variety of races, including governor's races in Wisconsin. That is substantial, and that's because people are being strong advocates and continue the work. Please continue the work.
Danny in Fort Lauderdale, you're on the air with Congressman Pocan.
Hello. I just have a question about an article on the Hill from yesterday about Mr. Mulvaney's comments to the American Bankers Association, basically saying that if the Republicans want to affect policy, then they need to basically bribe their congressmen. And I was wondering if you all are aware of that.
If the bankers want to affect policy. Yeah. Thank you, Danny.
Yes.
Yeah, Danny, at the very beginning of the program, we had a little conversation about this because I found those comments especially interesting in that, one, he basically could be in violation of several laws by saying that's how he operated. But secondly, just the idea that his encouragement was to give more money to people is what he was trying to encourage them to do, and that, that's somehow the point of access to members of Congress when there's a growing movement out there right now, including the Progressive Caucus. Our PAC has voted to not take corporate money, and you're finding more candidates doing that. So there is some real momentum, that just the opposite of what's going on with what Mr. Mulvaney said. But again, it shows part of why Washington is so very broken. Until you change our campaign finance laws, you enable people like Mick Mulvaney to not only be a member of Congress with those kind of rules in his office, but to move ahead and become a cabinet secretary.
George in Chicago, you're on the air with Congressman Pocan.
Hi, Tom. Thanks for taking my call, Congressman.
Yeah, hi, George.
Hello. Regular listeners of Tom's show are well aware of his warning that if you make your argument in terms of Adolf Hitler, you've lost it already. But I would like to point out a disquieting parallel. When I think about Trump's demands for personal loyalty and signing non-disclosure agreements, it's a reminder that members of the German military and I believe government officials in the Third Reich did not swear an oath of loyalty or service to the nation. They swore a personal oath of loyalty to their Führer.
Yeah.
And these kind of oaths and demands that Trump makes are disquietingly tyrannical, and they're quintessentially un-American and anti-American. Your comments?
Yeah, George, first of all, I would agree with Tom. I think whenever we raise Nazis, we, I think, often fail to make the argument that we sometimes can very convincingly make that there's a parallel. I just don't know if it's our best place. However, the second part of what you said is completely true. I mean, it shows the weakness of what he has going for him, that he has to demand a personal loyalty oath, that somehow he supersedes the country that we actually take a sworn oath to, that he thinks he's above that. It's to me, it's just part of the continued dysfunction we have here. It's why we're seeing a growing trend of people who don't watch Fox News or MSNBC, who aren't left or right, coming out and voting because they're just disgusted with the way this administration is operating. So I think it's a good, very illustrative example that the fact that, you know, you can't actually be a leader without somehow demanding personal loyalty just shows how weak of a leader you really are.
Yolanda in Spanaway, Washington. You're on the air with Congressman Pocan.
Good morning, Tom. Good morning, Congressman. I just heard something earlier in this great programming. We get to listen to Ms. Goodman in the morning, and then we get you. I mean, it's a crazy morning. It keeps us going.
Yeah, KBCS is a great station.
What I'd like to ask the senator is that last week supposedly there was a law that was declared unconstitutional by Vice President Mike Pence regarding tissue from aborted fetuses. And I thought that was, you know, we didn't have to choose, that it was our choice as a woman to do what we want. But this young woman in Texas, they wouldn't take care of her unless she made a choice. They shamed her after the loss of her pregnancy to choose to either have the remains in a public burial or pay for it to have a full burial for her lost pregnancy. And she had to, otherwise they wouldn't take care of her. And that's the law in Texas, supposedly. Is that true?
I couldn't tell you what the law in Texas is, Yolanda, but I think your point, which is very, very well taken, is the aggressiveness of the anti-choice movement and the way that they will do anything to make their point happen is really amazing. The way that they'll intimidate women going into a clinic, the way that they'll try to change laws to make it that you and your doctor aren't making your own medical decisions. On things like research on fetal tissue, we are coming up with some amazing developments that are helping people to live and live healthier and longer, and yet they're somehow trying to make this about some issue that, again, goes back to an old rallying cry of part of their base. The fact that they'll do politics over policy every single time on this is really pretty reprehensible, and we're still going to be facing that. The good news is the vast majority of people don't agree with their position. It is becoming a more and more of a minority position, but they're not going down without really being very nasty along the way.
Eric in Colorado Springs, Colorado. It says here, Eric, you're listening on Netroots. Is there a news station that I didn't know about?
No, it's just a website that offers progressive programs I listen to on occasional basis.
Yeah.
Can you guys hear me well?
Yeah, just fine.
Yeah.
You're on with Congressman Pocan.
Okay, thanks for taking my call. And my question is to the congressman. Obviously, today in Washington D.C., there was in the Supreme Court they held the oral arguments over the travel ban. And the reports I'm getting is that obviously the liberal justices were pretty sounded quite critical of the president's travel ban, but the conservative justices on the bench were sounding much more supportive. So it kind of gets me into a more worst case scenario of what would happen if the justices decide to make the travel ban permanent. And my question to the congressman is, if that were the case, is there anything that Congress can do to make sure that people from certain countries aren't permanently prohibited from ever trying to immigrate into this country? Because to me, if that were to happen, if the Supreme Court were ever to make that ruling, that would just, to me, would make it fundamentally un-American, or I don't know, just seems so wrong if that were to happen.
Yeah, or even to visit the country. Thank you, Eric.
Yeah. Well, I think the ruling would be on whether the president had the authority to do it, but obviously an act of Congress could supersede, I think, whatever the president did, short of being something an act of Congress. So we could then at that point try to get members to step up and do the right thing and not put not only a terrible statement to the world forward from our country, but also something that I would argue puts our troops in jeopardy across the world, and a lot of other negative effects that we don't want to have. So if I think we're expected it by the end of June, we should have a decision from the Supreme Court. If it goes that way, I think that's when we'll have to try to kick congressional action into place, and if not, it'll be an issue in November.
Sounds like a plan. Congressman Mark Pocan taking your calls in our Middays with Mark hour here on the Thom Hartmann Program. You can contact you can reach his website at Pocan, POCAN.house.gov. You can tweet him at Rep, as in Representative, R-E-P, Rep Mark Pocan. We'll be right back with more of your calls for Congressman Pocan right after this.
You're listening to Thom Hartmann. Visit ThomHartmann.com for audio and video archives.
Congressman Pocan, one of the true leaders of the Democratic Party, the co-chair of the Congressional Progressive Caucus. We'll be back with your calls. And welcome back. Paul in Hayesville, Kansas. Thanks for watching Free Speech TV. You're on the air with Congressman Pocan.
Good morning, gentlemen. A while back, I ran across a short but, how can I say, perhaps sweet one sentence, that I thought is a real good root definition, maybe oversimplified, but a good root definition of fascism, especially in today's world, this country. And that sentence was, corporate claims to constitutional rights is fascism. Is that oversimplified too much?
Good question, Paul. I mean, I always get a little nervous when we use words like fascism because people have very strong reactions, which might be what you do to get their attention. But I want to think about that a little bit. I mean, I think what the idea behind it is absolutely true. The fact that somehow corporations have as much power as they do in this country, whether it be via so-called free speech when it comes to campaign finance reform, when it comes to the power they have in Washington because of all the lobbyists and all the donations they make, whether it be the connections they have to corporate media because they are the same. There are plenty of reasons that there is a challenge there and why we need to address things like antitrust law and so many other things in Congress when we have maybe some different faces here. I just would have to think about it. I always get a little bit nervous when we use certain terms, like why we don't compare things to Nazis because it turns more people off. On the question of fascism, I'm not sure if that's the best way, but certainly we need to educate people on what corporate power actually means to this country and what it really means to the working families that are never on the positive receiving end of what comes out of what they usually promote here in Washington.
Excellent point. Just a couple data points here. If you Google my name and Henry Wallace in quotes, you'll find a number of pieces that I've written quoting from his 1944 letter, op-ed published in the New York Times where they asked him explicitly, are there American fascists? How do you define fascism? And he went on at some length about fascism being the merger of corporate and state interests. And the 1987 definition from the American Heritage Dictionary was, and I quote, fascism is the merger of corporate and state interests combined with belligerent nationalism. So that was by and large the definition up until the Reagan era. And then most dictionaries seem to have changed it to be more like, you know, tough guy governments kind of things.
And Tom, what would be interesting is now in 2018 to have a focus groups around the country to see what people react to that and what they understand it to be. Because I was a journalism school major. We were taught to speak at an 8th grade level. can communicate, if you want to get to the mass amount of people. And I'm always very careful of how we talk about things because I want to make the concepts as understandable as possible. I thought Paul Wellstone was, I thought, a master at this when he, former U.S. Senator from Minnesota. And I absolutely love one of the sayings he said is a saying that I live by, which is, we all do better when we all do better, right?
Yeah.
It's just so simple, but it says everything that so many people say in 7- and 9-syllable words.
Yeah.
It says it masterfully.
Yeah, and that 8th grade thing, by the way, is not because people are stupid. It's because nobody has any time and they want to get the information in a clear, quick, concise way.
Exactly, and if we want to communicate, we should follow those rules.
Amen. Congressman Mark Pocan taking your calls. More right after this. Welcome back. It's Congressman Mark Pocan with us, Middays with Mark, the co-chair of the Congressional Progressive Caucus, taking your calls. Sam in Hollandale, Florida, you're on the air with Congressman Pocan.
Yes, hi. I was wondering, when are we going to get to the truth of, any of these Republicans that are truly Trump supporters really are just flat out racist. They can't say he's conservative because he's not conservative. We're going to have $1 trillion debt. He cares nothing about so-called conservative values. He's been divorced 3 times, allegedly cheated on his wife 3 times. He has not one DNA of conservatism. But yet these Republicans still, the 40%, are still infatuated with him. And it really just comes down to one thing, and it's flat-out racism. Even the abortion issue. This guy believed in pro-choice for 60 years of his life. Now all of a sudden he's pro-life. I think it's just a lie to throw a dog to his base. But I think we got to call a spade a spade. And this is basically 40% of the United States population that's racist. That's it. It's that simple. This is why they support him.
Yeah, I'll tell you, Sam, you bring up a very interesting point. I was trying to find an article I had here where they just did a study of some of the Trump supporters, and what they found is that people are afraid of losing their status. They're not necessarily supporters because economically they've lost their job or they don't feel like they're better off. They feel like as white men they're going to lose their status. I would argue
privilege.
Yeah, the privilege, exactly. So of the, I would argue 35%, not 40, that's still kind of with him. I have said this, and I have said it publicly. I think about half of that number is probably there largely for reasons that many of us would call racist, or they're just afraid of losing that status. I think it's a very large chunk of that support for all the great reasons you brought up. This guy is a fake conservative at best. He doesn't actually live any of the values of conservatism. And the fact that Paul Ryan and Mitch McConnell roll over and get their bellies rubbed by him and act like he's a leader of the Republican Party when he's actually changed what the Republican Party actually means today. But fine, if that's the way they're willing to go, then all the more reason. But your point is really valid. There is a large chunk of that base, and I would argue probably about half of that 35%, that is just plain afraid to lose their status, their privilege that they have, and it's just proven in a study. And unfortunately, I can't find the article, but I just read it in the last 24 hours.
Yeah. Vince in Beloit, Wisconsin, you're on the air with Congressman Pocan.
Well, let me turn my speaker off here. I was listening to Amy Goodman, and she gave a report on the Egypt's war with Yemen and waging it with the arms supplied by the United States,
right, along with the Saudis.
And the condition there is, over 1 million people that are in dire straits with cholera. With cholera and the disease conditions and starvation, and you hear nothing of that. And recently, they have a propensity to attack weddings. The other one the other night killed 20 people. We don't hear about it unless we listen to Thom or Amy Goodman or some other progressive progressive shows, nobody knows about this. When are we going to bring this to light, and when are we going to, adamantly condemn this type of policy in the United States? And when is the Democratic Party going to, continue to do that? And are they going to make it a part of the platform for the elections coming up?
Vince, thank you. And also, you're a constituent. You're in Beloit, Wisconsin. So thanks for calling in. First of all, you helped me make the point that we have on this conversation, which is the corporate media doesn't cover some of the bigger tragedies. I mean, it's Yemen and Syria are the two biggest, I would say, problems we have in the planet right now as far as people dying and that are needlessly dying over starvation and disease because of a war. And this is an issue that we have done things with. Representative Ro Khanna from California and myself led the efforts in Congress to try to force a vote on it. We were not successful. The Senate rules are different. So Bernie Sanders, along with Senator Mike Lee, a Republican, did try to force a vote, and they were a few votes shy of getting it so that they could actually take some action on this. But that's the first time we've had a major debate, and yet you don't see the corporate media pick it up because, honestly, tragedy in Yemen doesn't sell detergent. And maybe some of them are affiliated with weapons manufacturers, and they don't want to have that message out there. So there have been some actions, but largely not covered. We have talked about this here on Tom's show, which I always appreciate. But we are aware of it. We are trying to make more awareness around this. We had, I want to say 80 or 90% of the Senate Dems vote with Bernie. We had some Republicans that voted with them as well, but not enough to actually take action on the issue. And we need to do more, and I think we're going to try to revisit it because obviously this is a human tragedy.
James in Spokane, Washington. We have a minute and a half left here, James.
Yeah, I wanted to direct my attention to the fact that Paul Ryan stymies a lot of progressive and Democratic bills that are proposed. I'm just wondering how that came to pass.
I'm sorry, I didn't know if I got the question.
He said Paul Ryan is blocking a lot of progressive legislation.
Blocking. I thought he said passing.
No, he said stymies.
I must have missed. So the 99.999% way something gets on the floor of Congress is the Speaker puts it there. There's a rarely used process called a discharge petition where you have to get 218 people to sign something on the floor of Congress. Rarely used, I believe, about a half a dozen times since the 1930s because it's hard to get someone to go against their party because there's plenty of ways they can punish you. So it's up to Paul. So if Paul's not putting it there, that's one of the main reasons why I've been so strongly advocating Paul should leave Congress. He's luckily leaving Congress now, why I've been supporting Randy Bryce in that race to try to get an improvement. But that's the problem. Whoever's the Speaker has tremendous power, and when they don't use that power well, they can block these bills from ever getting votes.
Congressman, in our last 15 seconds, things we should be looking for this week?
I think, not necessarily this week, Tom, but something I'm really concerned about is the Farm Bill coming up. Once again, they're attacking people who are on food stamps with work requirements. Vast majority of people who get food stamps are children, disabled, seniors, people already working jobs. And once again, people who get maybe $100 a month for food assistance or a drop over, they're not getting rich off of this. This is just another attack on poor people, and it's a part of the Farm Bill, and we have to watch it closely.
Meanwhile, multimillionaire talk show hosts are getting millions of dollars from HUD to buy to become slumlords.
Precisely.
It's amazing. Congressman Pocan, thank you so much.
Absolutely. Thank you, Tom.
We'll be back.
You're listening to Thom Hartmann.
The Thom Hartmann Program is brought to you in part by the Aiden Forecast, an investment newsletter with weekly updates of leading market indicators and a monthly deep dive into what the details of the economy and the markets mean for investors and retirees. On the web at aidenmarkets.com.
Wines have some of the highest pesticide levels in our food chain. This hour brought to you by ecowine.com. Pesticide-free wines, organic wines, imported from France by the Organic Wine Company, ecowine.com.
The Thom Hartmann Program is brought to you in part by Super Beets. Super Beets are sourced from non-GMO beets, and they're packed with dietary nitrates, helping to produce nitric oxide for more energy, stamina, and support for healthy blood pressure levels naturally.
Call 800-568-9889 or go to tomsbeets.com. That's 800-568-9889, Tom's Beets, THOMSBEETS.com. Welcome to the Thom Hartmann University Book Club. Today we're reading from Settlers, The Mythology of the White Proletariat, The True Story of the White Nation by J. Sakai, published by Morningstar Press in 1989. This is from Chapter 2, The Foundations of Settler Life. The life of European settlers and the class structure of their society was abnormal because it was dependent upon a foundation of conquest, genocide, and enslavement. The myth of the self-sufficient white settler family clearing the wilderness and supporting themselves through their own initiative and hard labor is a propaganda fabrication. It is the absolute characteristic of settler society to be parasitic, dependent upon the super-exploitation of oppressed peoples for its style of life. Never has Euro-American society completely supported itself. This is the decisive factor in the consciousness of all classes and strata of white society from 1600 to now. Settler society was raised up above the level of backward old Europe by a foundation of conquest. This conquest was a miracle drug for a Europe convulsed with the reaction of decaying feudalism and deadly capitalism. Shot into the veins of the Spanish feudal nation, for instance, the miracle drug of the New World conquest gave Spain the momentary power to overrun North Africa, Holland, and Italy before her historical incident waned. Like many such fixes for Euro-Americans, this conquest was addicting. It was habit-forming and rapidly indispensable, not only culturally, but in the mechanism of an oppressor society whose lifeblood was new conquest. We'll examine this later in the relationship of settlerism to imperialism. For now, it's enough to see that this conquest is a material act of great magnitude, an economic and social event as important as the emergence of the factory system or the exploitation of petroleum in the Middle East. We stress the obvious here because the Euro-American settlers have always made light of their invasion and occupation, although the conquered territory is the precondition for their whole society. Traditionally, European settler societies throw off the propaganda smoke screens that they didn't really conquer and dispossess other nations. They claim with false modesty that they merely moved into vacant territory. So the early English settlers depicted America as empty, a howling wilderness, unsettled, sparsely populated, just waiting with a vacant sign on the door for the first lucky civilization to walk in and claim it. Theodore Roosevelt wrote defensively in 1900, quote, "The settler and pioneer have at bottom had justice on their side. This great continent could not have been kept as nothing but a game preserve for squalid savages," end of quote. It is telling that this lie is precisely the same lie put forward by white Afrikaner settlers who claim that South Africa was literally totally uninhabited by any Africans when they arrived from Europe. To universal derision, these European settlers claim to be the only rightful historic inhabitants of South Africa. Or we can hear similar defenses put forward by the European settlers of Israel, who claim that much of the Palestinian land and buildings they occupy are rightfully theirs, since the Arabs had allegedly decided to voluntarily abandon it all during the 1948-49 war. Are these kinds of tales any less preposterous than those put forward by Euro-American settlers? America was spacious and sparsely populated only because the European invaders destroyed whole civilizations and killed off millions of Native Americans to get the land and profits they wanted. We all know that when the English arrived at Virginia, for example, they encountered an urban, village-dwelling society far more skilled than they were in the arts of medicine, agriculture, fishing, and government. This civilization was reflected in a chain of 300 Indian nations and peoples stretching from the Arctic Circle to the tip of South America, many of whom had highly developed societies. There was, in fact, a greater population in these Indian nations in 1492 than in all of Western Europe. Recent scholarly estimates indicate that at the time of Columbus, there were 100 million Indians in the hemisphere, 10 million in North America, 25 million in Central Mexico, and an additional 65 million elsewhere in Central and South America. These numbers have long been concealed since they give rise to the logical question of what happened to this great mass of people. The European invaders, Spanish, Dutch, English, Portuguese, and French, simply killed off millions and millions to safeguard their conquest of the land and provide the disposable slave labor they needed to launch their new world. Conservative Western historical estimates show that the Spanish reduced, in quotes, the Indian population of their colonies from some 50 million to only 4 million by the end of the 17th century. And from the 10 million Indians who once inhabited North America, after 4 centuries of settler invasion and rule, there were in 1900 perhaps 200,000 to 300,000 surviving descendants in the United States. This was the very substantial down payment towards the continuing blood price that third world nations have to pay to sustain the Euro-American way of life. So when we hear that the settlers pushed out the Indians or forced the Indians to leave their traditional hunting grounds, we know that these are just code phrases to refer politely to the most barbaric genocide imaginable. It could well be the greatest crime in all of human history. Only here, the Adolf Eichmanns and Heinrich Himmlers had names like Benjamin Franklin and Andrew Jackson. The point is that genocide was not an accident, not an excess, not the unintended side effect of virile European growth. Genocide was the necessary and deliberate act of the capitalists and their settler shock troops. The book Settlers.
Special Thom Hartmann.
This is the Thom Hartmann Program.
Welcome back. Thom Hartmann here with you, and let's talk a little bit about Mick Mulvaney here. There's something really, really wrong, and the question in my mind is, how long is it going to be before we start seriously enforcing the law? I mean, this guy is just nakedly, enthusiastically breaking the law. What's it going to take for this guy to go to prison? Mick Mulvaney, here's just some background. First of all, he spoke to the Bankers Association yesterday or the day before, and came right out and said that it's all about pay to play, right? I mean, he just said out loud what we know has been going on all along in the Republican Party in a big way, and now the entire Congressional Progressive Caucus, the second largest caucus in Congress, might be the largest, but in any case, it's one of the largest caucuses in Congress, entirely Democrats. It's progressives. There are no longer progressive Republicans. There used to be, but no longer. But the Congressional Progressive Caucus, all of their members have said, I'm not going to take PAC money. No more corporate PAC money. Kamala Harris just came out and said she's no longer going to take corporate PAC money, which is a big deal, by the way, for a senator from California, because California is a very expensive state to run for the Senate from. And of course, I'm assuming she has presidential ambitions too. So what she's basically saying to us all is, this is the new standard for the Democratic Party. If you want to become president, if you want or maintain your Senate position. But Mick Mulvaney loves corporate money. I mean, he came right out. This is from the New York Times, Glenn Thrush writing. He's formerly a Republican congressman from South Carolina, Mick Mulvaney. And he told 1,300 bankers and lending industry officials at the American Bankers Association conference in D.C., quote, "We had a hierarchy in my office in Congress. If you're a lobbyist who never gave us money, I didn't talk to you. If you're a lobbyist who gave us money, I might talk to you." Right. And now he comes into the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau. By the way, Trump breaking the law here, the law that authorized the Dodd-Frank, which authorized and created the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, which Mulvaney wants to even change its name so people, will be confused by the acronyms. This is, I mean, destruction by 1,000 paper cuts. The legislation that authorized this agency says explicitly that if the director resigns or leaves or is fired or whatever, if the director's gone, when the director leaves, the number 2 person has to replace the director. And the number 2 person at the CFPB was a very, very competent and very enthusiastic, person who was eager to continue the mission of the job. And Donald Trump defied the law. Defied the law and made Mick Mulvaney the so-called acting director, because he's not the director. In theory, he's not breaking the law, but I think that that's like a distinction or a difference without a distinction, or vice versa. But what Mick Mulvaney has done now is, as the head of the agency that oversees banks, he's now saying to the bankers, give Republicans more money, and they will do what you want. And there's something just like fundamentally wrong with that. But this is how Mick Mulvaney has conducted himself throughout his career in Congress. Back in this, by the way, this is from our friend Carl Frisch over at alliedprogress.org is the website. You can check it out. Mick Mulvaney took thousands of dollars in contributions from associates of Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac while he worked on, this is when he was in Congress, while he worked on legislation directly related to those companies. Mulvaney raked in thousands in campaign contributions from employees of Fannie and Freddie's lobbying firm and a major hedge firm. There was a possible pay-to-play with the Credit Union Special Interest Trade Group. This was the Credit Union National Association. They showered Mulvaney with tens of thousands of dollars in campaign contributions. Their investment paid off. Again, I'm quoting from Carl Frisch. Their investment paid off when Mulvaney's CFPB announced it would, quote, reconsider various aspects of new home mortgage disclosure data reporting requirements designed to, quote, now this is what he's undoing, reporting requirements designed to, quote, identify potential discriminatory lending practices in the marketplace. So there was a law in the books that was enforced by the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau that said when you're lending money, you're a credit union, you're lending money out to people, you may not choose not to lend people based on their race. Mick Mulvaney struck that down, said he didn't actually strike down the law, he simply said we're no longer going to enforce this law. We have other priorities, of course. And the Credit Union National Association, CUNA, issued a press release saying this was a significant win. We can now discriminate against black people. It's amazing. The auto dealers. This is another one. The National Automobile Dealers Association, the NADA, gave Mulvaney, again, tens of thousands of dollars. And in February of 2018, quoting Carl, that investment paid off when Acting Director Mulvaney stripped the agency's Fair Lending Office of enforcement powers. So there's a division within the CFPB that makes sure that people don't discriminate. And Mulvaney said, you can no longer prosecute people. You can no longer enforce the law. And of course, the Auto Dealers, National Automobile Dealers Association is quite happy about that. Hey, we bought Mulvaney. He did what we wanted. World Acceptance Corporation, they bought Mulvaney. This goes all the way back to 2010. And sure enough, the CFPB was investigating the World Acceptance Corporation for breaking federal laws relating to their loans. And Mulvaney took over the CFPB, and guess what? That investigation just went away. The laws that they were breaking had to do with what they were doing. This, in ProPublica in 2013, did an investigation on World Acceptance Corporation, quote, that showed how the company's loans were deceptively expensive and often trapped borrowers in the cycle of debt. And then Janet Matriciani, she was the CEO of World Acceptance Corporation, right, this bank. She sent an email to Mulvaney asking, requesting that he would become the director of the CFPB. This is crazy. I mean, this is pay for play.
This is a violation of multiple laws, including bribery laws, but I think most importantly, this is what's called honest services fraud. There is a law, it's 18 U.S.C. 1346, and it defines honest services fraud as a scheme to, or artifice to defraud, to deprive another of the intangible right of honest services. Now, honest services in this case, and it's typically interpreted to be this, are the right to be represented in Congress by somebody who's looking out for your interests, not the interests of people who are paying them. Recent notable prosecutions: George Ryan, the former governor of Illinois, is convicted in 2006 of honest services fraud. Don Siegelman was convicted in 2006 of honest services fraud. I would add, I think inappropriately, but that's what he was convicted of. Duke Cunningham, remember the guy with the boat, the monkey business? He was in the same marina I was in D.C. He was convicted of honest services fraud. Bob Ney, my friend, former congressman, former Republican congressman. I didn't know him back then, but I've known him since he got out of prison, and started hanging out with the Dalai Lama and meditating. And he goes to India several times a year, and he's turned into a really wonderful guy. I'm sure he probably was all along, but he doesn't describe himself as a nice guy all along. In his own semi-autobiography, Sideswiped, he was convicted of honest services fraud. Rod Blagojevich was indicted for honest services fraud in 2009. Sue Schmidt, she was an Alabama state legislator. She was convicted in 2009 of honest services fraud. And Bob McDonnell and his wife Maureen, the former governor of Virginia, all of these people were prosecuted for honest services fraud. In other words, taking money from somebody who has business before the government and then doing, as a government official, what those people want. So the question I ask you is, what's it going to take to put these guys in jail? Now, obviously, I think that we should all be calling 202-225-3121 and saying to our members of Congress, Mick Mulvaney just admitted that he takes bribes and is in violation of the laws against honest services fraud. Please open a congressional investigation. Now, he's going to be interviewed before Congress next week. And I'm guessing that the Democrats are going to bring this up. But frankly, I think the Justice Department should be bringing this up. So, and perhaps a larger question is, more broadly speaking, how do we clean up our government? We actually had pretty aggressive laws against a lot of this stuff that were passed, in many of them, some of them in 1906 and 1907. For example, the Tillman Act was passed by Teddy Roosevelt. No more, corporate money for federal candidates. But then, in 73, we passed a bunch of them, but the Supreme Court struck them down in 76.
This is the Thom Hartmann Program.
Back with your calls and more of the news of the day after this. And welcome back. And I would say to anybody who was on hold who had wanted to talk to Congressman Pocan, I'd be glad to take your call afterwards. Typically we tell people that. Let's see here, Bill in McKinney, Texas. Hey, Bill, thanks for watching or listening or whatever you're doing there at ThomHartmann.com. What's up?
Tom, thanks for taking the call. Thanks for all the information, the great forum today. I had wanted to get your opinion as well as Congressman Pocan's, but I'm certainly interested in hearing your opinion on the following question. With all the crises that we are facing today, and as a student of history, I see that we are facing many, I'm still concerned that the Democrat Party...
There's no such thing as a Democrat Party, Bill. That's a phrase that Eugene McCarthy came up with, and he said, and always emphasize rat. And so it's something you hear on Fox News and right-wing hate radio, but there literally is no such thing. When Thomas Jefferson named the party, it was the Democratic Party. It still is.
Yeah, okay. I won't argue. I won't quibble that with you at all. My question is this. Those who call themselves Democrats today, and I am not among them, I'm neither a Republican, but I'm concerned that there is not a sense of genuine urgency coming from many of them, many of the certainly traditional or corporatist Democrats for sure, But it seems that there are only people like Bernie, maybe Senator Warren, possibly at times Senator Harris, and a handful of others who really seem to be addressing the urgency of the issues that we're facing. I'd like to hear your thoughts on that.
What are the issues that you're concerned about that you think have urgency?
Oh, well, we can tick a bunch of them off, but certainly I think the biggest elephant in the room is the climate issue, global warming, however you want to characterize
Well,
that.
the entire Democratic Party is on board with that. I mean, that's part of their platform.
No. I'm not saying it isn't part of their platform. What I'm saying is I don't think there is a sense of urgency coming from the Democrats, and I'd like to have your take on that.
I think that the Democratic Party and Democrats, broadly speaking, both elected and electors, voters, are increasingly speaking out, increasingly getting active. I mean, what we saw in Arizona the other day, and Bill, thank you for the call. What we saw in Arizona yesterday, where a congressional district that Trump won by 21 points, and that the congressman who, Trent Franks, I think his name was, who had offered 2 young women in his office $5 million to apparently have sex with him, and thus resigned. He won by 37 points. And in this race, the Republican beat the Democrat by 5 points, as I recall. And so, you know, that tells me that Democrats, either the Democrats are getting more active or the Republicans are discouraged, or that Republicans are increasingly saying, you know, this is not the Republican Party that I thought it was. This has become a party of corporate shills, apologists for billionaires, suck-ups to billionaires, and, you know, completely dependent upon dark money. And, you know, which is all true, by the way. So it shouldn't be a surprise that the Republicans are starting to think like this. So anyhow, it's, that's my take on it. I think people are waking up. I think the voters are waking up, and I think the Democrats are waking up. And they're moving in a more progressive direction. I was going to say they're moving left, but, you know, progressivism is really the center in America. We'll be right back. Welcome back. Mick Mulvaney, the headline in the New York Times, Mulvaney, Watchdog Bureau's leader, advises bankers on ways to curtail agency. That and anything that we discussed with Congressman Pocan this morning, things you'd like to bring up, feel free to give us a shout. Mick Mulvaney, this is a statement from Carl Frisch. He said, Mick Mulvaney's frank confession to a room full of big bank lobbyists is more than just troubling. He appears to be admitting to a pay-to-play scheme that could put him in legal jeopardy. No one is above the law. Mulvaney must be held accountable for this unacceptable behavior, which casts a dark cloud over his actions at the CFPB, where he's made one decision after another that benefit the Wall Street special interests that bankrolled his congressional career with more than $1.2 million in campaign cash. Mick Mulvaney admitting to accepting bribes and then encouraging the bankers to offer bribes and thereby implicitly encouraging Republican members of Congress to accept bribes. It doesn't get worse than this. So, you know, what do we do with this? Where do we take this? How do we
you know, it seems to me like the step one is vote the bums out, right? But step one also should be, let's start prosecuting the bums. This is criminal activity that Mick Mulvaney is confessing to. There are laws on the books that Mick Mulvaney has violated. If my read of these laws is any indication, and I'm very familiar with Bob Ney's prosecution, and Bob Ney went to prison for not filing a document with the federal government saying that when Jack Abramoff took him to Scotland to play golf, that the cost of the trip, which was around $5,300 as I recall, it's been a while since I read Bob's book, but that sticks in my head, that $5,300, which was the airfare and the lodging and the course fees, that Bob Ney failed to file a form with the federal government saying that that was a gift to him from Jack Abramoff. And therefore, the government said, this is honest services fraud. You took money from somebody who has business before your committee and before Congress that you voted on and voted favorably to help Jack Abramoff off, or with, and you took, the equivalent of money from him. I mean, Bob Ney didn't even take money from Abramoff. He took a $5,000 trip to Scotland, and he went to prison for it. That's the Honest Services Act. They sent Don Siegelman to prison. And what they said he did was wrong was there was a hospital oversight board or commission that this guy, Richard Scrushy, had been appointed to. Now, Richard Scrushy was big in the hospital business. I don't recall the details of it, but he was big in the hospital business, perhaps at an earlier point in his career. But he had been appointed to this board by the Republican governor that preceded Don Siegelman. It's an unpaid position. Scrushy had supported an effort that Don Siegelman was promoting as governor to have a lottery in Alabama to help pay for the schools. And Scrushy made a $500,000 contribution to the lobbying effort, not to Don Siegelman. Don Siegelman did not see a penny of this, and he was not in charge of that lobbying effort. He simply supported it. And Siegelman appointed Richard Scrushy to the same board. It basically reappointed him to the exact same board that his Republican predecessor had appointed the guy to. And Karl Rove and Laura Canary, the wife of she was the federal prosecutor in Alabama, and she was the wife of the campaign manager of the guy that Don Siegelman ran against, Bob Riley. She put Don Siegelman in prison with Karl Rove's help for honest services fraud, basically taking a bribe, saying that $500,000 donation from Scrushy to the effort to have a lottery to pay for schools in Alabama was in exchange for being appointed to the hospital board. Now, Siegelman denied that then, he denies that today, and there's no actual evidence of that, but they threw him in prison. Now here you got Mick Mulvaney saying openly, when I was in Congress, I wouldn't talk to lobbyists unless they gave me money. And he's not in jail? Come on, riddle me back, Batman. I don't get this. Why is this guy, and half of the Republican caucus for that matter, not in prison right now?
You're listening to the Thom Hartmann Program. Call 202-808-9925.
Back with your calls right after this. We're reading today from the American Revolution of 1800 by Dan Sisson. He wrote the book 40 years ago. Recently, I went through, Dan and I actually went through, I wrote a foreword and an afterword to it and did some substantial editing on the book. And it's something you need to read. This is from the introduction, which I wrote.
It is rare when a book about our early republic is relevant 40 years after it was originally published. It is rarer still when that book provides insight into national problems we refuse to solve 2 centuries later. You are therefore holding in your hands or reading on your pad or computer one of the most important books you will ever encounter. Here is why. Unlike other histories of this era, this book is written from a revolutionary perspective, much like Jefferson's generation viewed the world. The American Revolution of 1800 was not just about an election. It was about the life and death struggle for power between democratic-republican principles and oligarchic plutocratic values based on corruption. In short, this book, by implication, is about the identical crisis America faces today. The author's unique analysis is based on the idea of faction controlling party and how both undermine constitutional government. In an age where modern parties and the factions that control them have paralyzed our government, this book validates the politics of the founders. In still another contribution, the book demonstrates how preserving revolutionary ideas within our culture depends on understanding the classical tradition. The ability to recognize a demagogue is rooted deeply in the role Caesar played in destroying the Republic of ancient Rome. That fear of a Caesar inspired Jefferson and others to organize citizens against the Federalists, thereby completely contradicting the political rules of their time. This book, above all, presents a profoundly positive view of Jefferson and his creativity in the midst of crisis. It celebrates his gift 24 years after he wrote the Declaration of Independence and proves he never abandoned his principles or his revolutionary vision for America's future. Ironically, it's become a cliche in political and economic circles that while we love Thomas Jefferson, we live in a country largely run by Alexander Hamilton's policies and John Adams's politics. This may have been more true of the roughly 200 years before the contemporary free trade era, beginning in the 1970s under Richard Nixon and exploding in the mid-1990s when Bill Clinton signed NAFTA. Alexander Hamilton must be rolling over in his grave. Nevertheless, we have become a mercantilist nation dominated by banks and big industries, as Hamilton envisioned. It is true that there were huge differences between Hamilton and Jefferson, particularly in their visions for the future of America and its economy. And those divisions tend to dominate interpretations of our political discussion when we reference the era of our first few presidents. But a much larger and more dramatic battle of worldviews played out in the late 1790s between President John Adams and Vice President Thomas Jefferson, leading directly to what is arguably the most transformational presidential election in the history of the United States, the election of 1800. In other books and places, both Dan Sisson and I have written at some length about the differences between these two men and their respective visions of America. Adams relished throwing newspapers editors in prison and demanded that when he and his wife visited a town, the local militia come out to fire their cannons and salute of him and shout, "God save President Adams." Jefferson was so horrified by Adams's Alien and Sedition Acts that he left town the day they were signed into law, and as president often wore simple homespun garments. He was known to answer the front door of the White House in his bathrobe, and more than one visitor mistook him for a servant. As president, Jefferson literally acted out his egalitarian visions of America. In my book, The Crash of 2016, The Plot to Destroy America and What We Can Do to Stop It, I describe Jefferson's concern over aristocracy in American politics. On October 28, 1813, in a letter to his old rival John Adams, Jefferson commented on his distrust of America's growing wealthy elite, naming in particular the Senate, which was not then democratically elected by the people. Referring to the, quote, cabal in the Senate of the United States, end quote, Jefferson wrote, "You, John Adams, think it best to put the pseudo-aristoi into a separate chamber of legislation, the Senate, where they may be hindered from doing their mischief by their coordinate branches, and where also they may be a protection to wealth against the agrarian and plundering enterprises of the majority of the people." Then Jefferson countered in the letter, writing, "I do not believe them, the Senate, necessary to protect the wealthy, because enough of them will find their way into every branch of the legislation to protect themselves." Instead, Jefferson wrote, "I think the best remedy is exactly that provided by all our constitutions, to leave to the citizens the free election. In general, they will elect the really good and wise. In some instances, wealth may corrupt and birth blind them, but not in sufficient degree to endanger society." And in a final warning about the largely Federalist cabal in the Senate, these would be the conservatives of their time, Jefferson wrote, quote, "The artificial aristocracy is a mischievous ingredient in government, and provision should be made to prevent its ascendancy. I think that to give them power in order to prevent them from doing mischief is arming them for it. and increasing instead of remedying the evil. In a 1786 letter to George Washington, Jefferson gave his most explicit warning about this threat of a military allied with the plutocracy within, and advocated for unwavering vigilance against it. Quote, "Though the day may be at some distance, beyond the reach of our lives perhaps, yet it will certainly come, when a single fiber left of this institution will produce an hereditary aristocracy which will change the form of our governments from the best to the worst in the world." Welcome back. Thom Hartmann here with you. Welcome back. And let's pick up some of your phone calls here. This is, you know, fraud in emoluments. I mean, that's the bottom line here. Maxwell in Sun Prairie, Wisconsin. Hey, Maxwell, your thoughts today?
Yeah, Tom, you sure know your history. I'm interested in this fraud and crime stuff. Yeah, I think the biggest criminal is Trump himself with these emoluments, and I haven't heard a thing about it.
Yeah.
And it bothers me that he's lining his pockets.
Oh, it's a clear violation of the law, and it's also a clear violation of his lease.
Is anybody doing anything about that?
To the best of my knowledge, all efforts to censure him, or censure him, rather, in Congress by Democrats in both the House and Senate have been blocked by Paul Ryan and Mitch McConnell.
Oh,
and the Justice Department, which works for Donald Trump, is not interested in prosecuting him. So, you know.
Well, you know, that makes McConnell and Paul complicit with everything as far as I'm concerned.
I agree. They have been complicit from day one.
Right,
absolutely.
right. Anyway, that's my concern. That's just one thing, but that's the biggest fraud of all.
Yeah, I agree. I absolutely agree. Maxwell, thank you. Well said. Anita in San Antonio. Hey, Anita, what's up?
Actually, there's a lawsuit that's been going forward on the emoluments clause issue. I know Richard Painter was involved in that, but yeah, there's one that a judge is allowed to go forward. So, because they had to prove standing. But yeah, that's in the justice. I mean, it's in the courts right now.
Yeah.
But I just wanted to say about as far as the Nick Mulvaney thing goes.
If I may, Anita, that is not a criminal prosecution. That's a civil lawsuit, you know, claiming that he's damaging us somehow.
Well, no, yeah, I know. You're right.
We need a criminal prosecution. This is a violation of criminal law.
Right. No, I know, but it's a violation of the Constitution.
That too.
So, yes, yes. But as far as the Nick Mulvaney thing goes, I think after the Bob McDonald case was thrown out by the Supreme Court, I think proving that quid pro quo is almost, you know, impossible, because you basically have to catch somebody with a bag of money on a video and, you know, prompt. And
well, no, Anita, what you have to do is catch somebody saying, if you give me this, I will do that, which is what Mick Mulvaney just said. He said, I only talk to lobbyists who give me money.
Well, yeah, but he didn't, I guess you'd have to prove the quid pro quo. I mean, somebody would have to
the pro quo is talking to them. I mean, he came right out and confessed this.
I don't know. I just don't know with the Supreme Court what would happen right now, if they would even, you know, pursue it. But, and also about the election last night, I think what's happening is women are leading this resistance.
Yes.
And it's certainly not going to be middle-aged white guys, or, you know, because they're still standing with Trump. It's the white women and women of color especially.
Yeah.
So I think we need to keep that in mind and give, you know, women credit for continuing to, and even the women that supported him, he's losing support among women more than any other group.
Yeah, well,
even the women who supported him,
because he's clearly a misogynist. But
well, he's disgusting.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
So, you know, anyway, I think women have his, you know.
I absolutely agree.
All right. Well, I just wanted.
Yeah, okay. Anita, thanks for the call. I'm trying to get up to the next caller here, but my call screen software keeps crashing on me.
Oh. All right. Well, you keep trying.
There we go. Okay. Thanks a lot, Anita. Appreciate the call. Eric in Auburn, Washington. Hey, Eric, what's up?
Hi, Tom. Hey, did you get to hear any of President Macron's address to Congress?
Yeah, I heard about half of it.
All right. Well, one thing that stood out, and I didn't even hear half of it, I look forward to hearing more of it, but his anti-nationalism stance really struck me. And, you know, frustration after frustration, obviously, with what's been going on the last, well, whenever. I mean, even back to Bush after 9/11. However, the one thing that I'm really feeling is that these days, those enlightened leaders, and Macron really spoke as an enlightened person, truly understand that today's national interest is really worldwide interest, that there really is so much at stake, and that nationalism is so narrow for today's world and what we're facing, that what we need to do is, I don't even know if we can bring along Trump supporters who feel so entitled, not just to their position and their
white privilege.
Thinking, white privilege, but there may come a point where it's just a matter of leaving them behind, because there is so much at stake with continuing to wander around in the dark in a trance, supporting somebody as horrendous as Trump and the people he's surrounding himself with, and to not realize that truly, internationally, we need to think on a global scale for what our national security interests are these days.
Yeah, I completely agree, Eric. And the other thing, and Eric, thanks for the call. The other thing that I thought was really noteworthy was when Macron talked about climate change and said we need to have a decarbonized economy. We need to decarbonize our economy. And the Democrats gave him a standing ovation, and the Republicans all sat on their hands. To my point, again, these are all Republicans who are taking money from the Koch network and other fossil fuel associated sources, all of them. And they all refused to applaud a line that said we need to do something about climate change. These fossil fuel barons and oligarchs are willing to destroy our planet and the future of the human race in exchange for short-term profits. It doesn't get more criminal and sociopathic than that. I mean, this is just beyond the pale. Jackie in Port Townsend, Washington. Hey, Jackie, what's up?
Hi. Well, this Mulvaney's actions, it's a perfect example of why we need to pass an amendment stating corporations are not people and money is not speech.
Amen.
And I wanted to say one good news is that Jefferson County passed a resolution at our Democratic County Convention a couple weeks ago, which is going to the state convention in June. And what it says is, because we can't tell our elected officials what to do, so we're begging them. We're begging them to follow the Washington State Democratic Party platform, which has had 8 resolutions opposing corporate personhood and unregulated campaign financing. And so it's in the party platform. This is what it says.
For the state of Washington.
For the state of Washington. Corporations are artificial entities not entitled to constitutional protections as persons. We oppose the undue influence of corporations on our society, government, and political process. And then in the other section, it says, we call for amending the Constitution to firmly establish that corporations are not people and money is not speech. Plus, in 2016, the state population, Republicans, Democrats, and Independents, passed an initiative that declare the people of Washington State support a constitutional amendment. So,
right, and you're not the only state to have passed that.
Yeah, but
this is sweeping the country right now.
If all the Democratic elected officials from top to bottom could make a statement saying, we support the platform, we support the amendment, that would be so meaningful.
Yeah, I agree. And Jackie, I think we're almost there. And we're certainly there. I mean, the Progressive Caucus has aggressively supported this kind of thing, which is, a little less than half of all the Democrats in the House of Representatives. So it's a substantial, this is a substantial movement, and a few of the Democrats in the Senate. It's a substantial movement, and it's growing, and that's a good thing. Jackie, thanks for the information. Frank in Zephyr Hills, Florida. Hey, Frank, what's up?
Yeah, I wanted to talk to you about an idea that I have that might solve a lot of problems. if the middle class had a national tax revolt, because it goes back to the 1700s when King George was not representing the people in the colonies. It was called taxation without representation. We're not going to get represented, but the lobbyists and the corporate America is getting
You're absolutely right. In fact, Gillens and Page at Northwestern University did a study that was reported about 3 years ago, where they found that if you were in the top 1%, the odds of legislation passing that reflected the desires of your class was, well above 50%. It was substantial. If you were in the top 10%, the odds of legislation passing that represented the interests of your class was still above 50%. It was measurable. It wasn't as high as the top 1%. It was more, the top 1% was like 70, 80%. Top 10% was like 60%, something like that. But if you were in the bottom 90%, there was absolutely no measurable correlation between what 90% of Americans want and what Congress passes as legislation. At the federal or state level, no correlation at all. It was equal to random noise. In other words, the bottom 90% of Americans are being completely ignored outside of the Congressional Progressive Caucus. And that's a disaster. I mean, that's a political disaster.
I wish that somebody was starting an organization that would have a national tax revolt, because it would be legal, because all three branches of the government are in violation of the Constitution.
Well, I remember the tax revolts back in the 60s. And in fact, I was working at a radio station, WITL, in Lansing, Michigan, when I was doing news, when the IRS and the FBI and the state police came by and told us that they were going to be busting some tax protesters down the road, and they didn't want us to report on it. And, those guys were like the militia movement. They were right-wing crazies. But refusing, and I knew people who, during the Vietnam War, refused to pay their taxes because they didn't support the Vietnam War. It could be a very dangerous thing to do. I think that the more powerful and direct action, Frank, and respectfully, and thank you for the call, is for us instead to simply say, we're going to replace these guys.
You're listening to Thom Hartmann. Visit ThomHartmann.com for audio and video archives.
We want, quite simply, taxation with representation. Is it too much to ask for? Really? And welcome back, Scott in Belgrade, Montana. Hey, Scott, what's up?
Hi, Tom. Thanks for taking my call.
Sure.
In regards to an earlier caller that was talking about Paul Ryan and Mitch McConnell being complicit in the Justice Department, being complicit with Trump's emoluments violations.
Right.
I believe that they're way more than complicit. They're actually active in this effort. And my point that kind of solidifies it for me is when Steve Daines was acting as an interim chair in the Senate, and Mitch McConnell introduced Rule 19 to block Senator Warren from having access to the congressional record. That is a direct felony obstruction of justice. And I hear nothing from anybody. I've tried to talk to Senator Tester's office, no response. I've called a few other people, no response. And, I mean, it was a direct violation of the law. And, if we're going to start pulling out congressional investigations, that also, in my opinion, needs to be one that needs to be addressed. And actually, my question would be, where do I go from here as I'm getting no response? So thanks for taking my call. I'll hang up.
Well, Scott, before you hang up, the people that John Tester is going to listen to first and foremost, John Tester is the senator from Montana, from your state, the people that John Tester, and he's a Democrat, the people that he will listen to first and foremost when he goes back to Montana are the people in the Democratic Party of Montana. They have regular meetings. They have regular meetings with their senators and their members of the House of Representatives. And so if you want your message to be heard by John Tester, if you want to sit down with him personally and make your case, all you have to do is get inside the Democratic Party there in Montana. Become a precinct committee person. It's, in most places, a voluntary job that takes one night a month, and sometimes a little more, sometimes a little less, depending on the state. And what you will find is that is probably the most efficient way to get your message
to your member of Congress outside of calling their office. But you've apparently tried that; it doesn't work. So and then Plan B would be if you don't have the time or the bandwidth to volunteer for your local Democratic Party or run as a precinct committee person, go talk to the people who are in the Democratic Party. Go to their next fundraising or their next party event, and lobby them, and they will talk to Tester. But the reality is that if you are inside the Democratic Party, this is true of the Republican Party to a much lesser extent, because by and large the power brokers in the Republican Party are lobbyists, whereas in the Democratic Party they are the local parties. And so but if you want to essentially lobby John Tester, that's the way to do it. And if you can find somebody who you know or who you can get to know who's inside the party, or go show up at the events and make not a financial contribution, but make a contribution of your argument, right? To present your argument, pass out some literature, whatever. I mean, you will find a receptive. If you don't come across as a monomaniac, as a one-issue crazy. Not to say that all people who are one-issue people are crazy, but you know what I'm talking about.
I agree with you completely. However, in Montana, the dynamic of the Democratic Party is much different than anywhere else in the nation.
Yeah.
Well,
that's only going to change if you and a bunch of your friends can take it over.
And just keep browbeating until someone listens to us.
Yeah. Well, keep it up, Scott. Keep it up. Thanks a lot for the call. And thanks for watching Free Speech TV. We'll be back. Ellen Ratner will be here with Talk Media News right after this. So let's check in with Talk Media News and find out what's up in the world today. This report brought to you by goatsfortheoldgoat.com, Ellen Ratner's charity in South Sudan, and Ellen's new book, Loving What You Do. And speaking of Ellen, she's on the line with us. Hey, Ellen, I hope all is well with you.
Well, thank you so much. Today, the president of France actually addressed a joint session of Congress. Now, he is here on a state visit. He was much different at Congress, I think, than he was at the White House yesterday.
Oh, yeah.
It's interesting. CNN did not carry it live. MSNBC and Fox carried his speech live, but CNN did not. Basically, he said that the United States and Europe was living in a time of fear, that closing the door to the world will not stop the evolution of the world. It will influence the fears of our citizens. He was talking about commercial war, which he means tariff war, is not consistent with our mission. And he says that he's sure one day that the United States will come back and join the Paris Agreement. And he said, my favorite line, he said, is, let's face it, there is no planet B.
Yeah. Yeah. A great pun and a true statement.
Last Sunday was Earth Day.
Yeah. Yeah, and they planted a tree a couple days ago, and that symbolism might have been lost on Trump, but I don't think it was on most of us.
No, it wasn't. Now, it's very interesting. Mark Knoller, who is the CBS guy at the White House and who I've known for years, and I always say he ought to write a book of his statistics. He keeps these statistics. And this is the 8th French presidential address to Congress, and it is absolutely on the day in 1960 that de Gaulle addressed Congress.
Really? Wow.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I can see Macron aspiring to be the next de Gaulle, the next great hero of France.
Yeah. Right. So interesting, of course, last night was the state dinner. It was very interesting. They invited many cabinet officers, but they weren't allowed a +1. I don't think. They certainly didn't bring a +1, so my guess is they weren't allowed a +1.
No, I saw the list. There weren't.
That's...
Yeah, I saw the list, and it didn't include spouses.
Right, exactly. So the other thing that is fascinating about the First Lady, who normally First Ladies wear dresses that are made in the United States or by a United States designer. She wore a French designer. Now, that may have been her hats off to France, or it may have just been that she likes French designers.
Yeah.
We don't know. We'll see what happens if there's a second state dinner.
Well,
the other thing is at the dinner, they served many vegetables, some of which came out of the White House gardens, but they did not acknowledge where they came from, which is because of Michelle Obama.
Well, this raises a whole other issue, Ellen, and it seems to me that the only reason why Trump is going off on the Iran deal is because when Obama was president, he had this great international diplomatic success with the Iran deal, and the Republicans, in a fit of hyper-partisanism and hating the first black president, decided that they just had to trash that 16 Ways to Sunday. We can't allow Obama to have even one single victory. And now they've painted themselves into a corner. They've got to continue trashing it to look like they're consistent, but they really never had a reason to trash. I mean, Trump, when he says, oh, we gave them hundreds of billions of dollars, he's lying. We allowed them access to their own money, which we had frozen since the revolution. We didn't give them a penny. And these guys are just lying through their teeth and trying to blow up a good deal simply because our nation's first black president was the guy who helped negotiate it. And it seems like Macron is coming along and saying, well, you know, maybe we can put the Trump name on it by slightly changing, you know, the facade of it a little bit. Do you think I'm right on this?
I think you're 100% right, and Macron is one smart cookie.
Yeah, yeah. So hopefully he can do that.
He really knows he really knows what he's doing. Now, also yesterday, the president, at his press conference, if you want to call it that, he allowed 3 questions from each side, and they were decided on ahead of time as to who he was going to call. But he said to Admiral Ronnie Johnson, who's the White House doctor, he said, well, what did you need this for? And then when he was asked about the fact that, you know, here was this huge agency and Ronnie Johnson hadn't had an experience, he said, well, no one has experience running an agency of 350,000 people. Now, that happens to be true. However, Ronnie Johnson's in trouble for a lot of other reasons, including perhaps running a hostile work environment and being a drinker.
Yeah, I think
and knocking on a woman's door at some hour of the morning.
Yeah, the thing that flagged me was that he's a kiss-up, kick-down guy. He's one of these people who, if you're his boss, he loves you and he's super obsequious. And if you work for him, he craps on you, he dumps on you. And that's, you know, I know people like that. And there's a startling number of them in both show business and politics. And, you know, God save us all from people like that.
For sure. Okay, a couple other interesting things. A federal judge appointed by George W. Bush in 2001 threw out the DACA provisions of the White House, or the lack of DACA provisions, and described it as arbitrary and capricious, and gave the Homeland Security folks 90 days to explain why the program is not unlawful.
So when does Trump take this?
Appointee.
Yeah, when does Trump take this to the Supreme Court?
Well, I think after he's finished the various federal courts, he'll take it to the Supreme Court. There's no question.
Yeah.
But, I mean, if the Supreme Court justices are like this judge who was appointed by George W. Bush, they're going to find the same thing. Except
that they're so partisan. I mean, you got Clarence Thomas, whose wife works for the Koch brothers, you know, for the Heritage Foundation. It's
right.
And in the travel ban pleadings yesterday, the 5 right-wingers on the court were all very skeptical of overturning Trump's travel ban. So I'm so saddened by the partisanship on the Supreme Court, Ellen.
I am too. And they're not taking the law into hands. Okay. Donald Trump looks like he is going to make a state visit to Britain after all, and it'll probably happen on July 13th.
Oh, that's going to be an interesting problem for Theresa May, isn't it?
Oh, it sure is. That looks like it's going to happen now.
Amazing. I'm surprised he didn't schedule it to be with the royal wedding, so they'd be forced to take him in. Ellen Ratner with Talk Media News. Thank you, Ellen.
Thank you.
Good talking with you. We'll be back.
You're listening to Thom Hartmann.
The Thom Hartmann Program is brought to you in part by the Aiden Forecast, an investment newsletter with weekly updates of leading market indicators and a monthly deep dive into what the details of the economy and the markets mean for investors and retirees. On the web at aidenmarkets.com.
Wines have some of the highest pesticide levels in our food chain. This hour brought to you by ecowine.com. Pesticide-free wines, organic wines, imported from France by the Organic Wine Company, ecowine.com.
The Thom Hartmann Program is brought to you in part by Super Beets. Super Beets are sourced from non-GMO beets, and they're packed with dietary nitrates, helping to produce nitric oxide for more energy, stamina, and support for healthy blood pressure levels naturally.
Call 800-568-9889 or go to tomsbeets.com. That's 800-568-9889, Tom's Beets, THOMSBEETS.com. It's the Thom Hartmann University Book Club, and today we're reading from Creating Freedom by Raul Martinez, The Lottery of Birth, The Illusion of Consent, and the Fight for Our Future. This is from the preface. Free markets, free trade, free elections, free media, free thought, free speech, free will. The language of freedom pervades our lives, framing the most urgent issues of our time and the deepest questions about who we are and who we wish to be. Freedom is a stirring ideal, central to the concept of human dignity and visions of a fulfilling and meaningful life. Its universal appeal, its ability to unite and inspire, have long made it a powerful political weapon. For some, it is the clarion call for revolution. For others, a justification of the status quo. Academics, think tanks, religions, political parties, and activists have recast the concept in different ways. In the scramble to define it, the ideal of freedom has been pushed, pulled, twisted, and torn, expertly molded to suit the interests of those with the power to shape it. Even as they steer our economies, democracies, and judiciaries, today's dominant conceptions of freedom are unknown to most people. They are part of the conceptual framework upon which society has been built, framing our thinking on everything from punishment and reward to capitalism and democracy. But this foundation, mixed as it is with myth and illusion, is crumbling. Plagued by civilizational crises, economic, political, and environmental, the towering edifice it supports is not only unstable and unsustainable, but unjust. For too long, the language of freedom has been used as a tool of control, helping to justify poverty, to erode democracy, to lend legitimacy to barbaric punishment. As inequality soars, economic crises erupt, people work longer for less, as refugees surge across borders, corporate power intensifies, forests disappear and sea levels rise. It is time to engage in a fundamental reassessment of this hallowed ideal. When a society fails on multiple fronts, its foundational ideas must be questioned. A simple principle animates these pages. The more we understand the limits on our freedom, the better placed we are to transcend them. We may well be less free than we like to think, but only through understanding the freedom we lack can we enhance the freedom we possess. Ignorance of our limitations leaves us vulnerable to those able to exploit them. Facing up to the myths on our freedom explodes a number of persistent myths, myths surrounding individual responsibility, justice, political democracy, and the market. Some of these myths persist because they advance the interests of those in power, others because they flatter us, offering comfort and false comfort. All come at a price. The way we think about freedom shapes our view of the present and our vision of the future. It is a lens through which we interpret and evaluate the world, a compass by which we set our course. But not all conceptions of freedom are created equal. Each is based on assumptions about the world, some of which fly in the face of evidence and logic. A sharp distinction is often drawn between questions of free will and those of political and economic freedom. Traditionally, these concepts have been separated into distinct categories, but this obscures more than it reveals. We dissect reality into manageable parts for study, but if we do not put those parts back together in order to gain an understanding of the whole, we risk losing sight of the big picture. We risk losing touch with reality.
This danger is inherent in modern education, where the price of progression through the system is specialization. Too often, where we should discover connections, we are taught to see impassable subject boundaries, but the limits on our freedom are interconnected. A thorough understanding in one area enriches and changes our perception in others. To delve deeply into the meaning of freedom, we have to breach disciplinary boundaries along the way. Insights and evidence from philosophers, psychologists, economists, historians, scientists, criminologists, and environmentalists all play a role in the discussion to come. By building connections and teasing out their far-reaching implications, a radical, cohesive framework emerges, one that provides a much-needed overview of where we are and where we could be. On the one hand, parts of society remain passive and deeply cynical about the possibility of change. On the other, social movements are rapidly growing around the world in response to the interlocking crises facing us. More and more, people are questioning the systems that dominate their lives and diminish their liberty. Against this backdrop, it's time to reclaim the ideal of freedom for the urgent task of putting people and planet before profit and power. We need a movement born of a shift in consciousness, one that will challenge the assumptions upon which our society is founded. To value truth, that elusive but all-important ideal, is to try and follow it beyond the shell that encloses our present understanding, to break through the defining labels of our inherited identity, the disciplinary boundaries that characterize our education, and the limits set by society on our imagination. This book challenges ingrained assumptions about ourselves and the world and calls for an urgent transformation in our thinking and behavior. It is a manifesto for deep and radical change. Through the prism of freedom, it examines the limitations of our dominant ideas and the failings of our current system. But it also explores the great potential that exists to create something better. Creating Freedom by Raul Martinez. The book. Light. Right.
This is the Thom Hartmann Program.
Faiza Patel is on the line with us. Faiza is the co-director of the Liberty and National Security Program at the Brennan Center for Justice. BrennanCenter.org is the website. You can tweet Faiza at F-I-I-Z-A-P-A-T-E-L BCJ or at Brennan Center. Faiza, welcome to the program.
Thanks. I'm happy to be here.
Thanks for joining us. So Trump's Muslim ban was argued before the Supreme Court. Was it yesterday?
This morning.
This morning?
Just, yes.
Great. So what happened?
So basically, you had the justices asking the tough questions of both parties. As you know, the challenge to the ban is based on the fact that it discriminates against an entire religion, that it was intended to discriminate against Muslims, and that was pretty obvious from the statements that Trump made both as a candidate and then his obvious anti-Muslim bias since he's been elected president as well. So that was really at the heart of the discussion today.
So what's the, well, let's just back up a little bit. The Muslim ban, detail for us the history of this thing and, you know, why it is that the Trump administration is not calling it a Muslim ban and everybody else is, and how it got before the Supreme Court.
Sure. So if you recall, back in December of 2015, Donald Trump declared that he wanted to ban Muslims from the United States. That was the first that we'd heard of this ban, and that became sort of part of his regular campaign platform. He was elected president, and within a week he issued an executive order which banned people from 7 Muslim-majority countries from traveling to the United States. You'll recall the scenes of chaos that ensued at airports around the country as people try to figure out what this ban was all about. That ban was pretty quickly enjoined by federal courts around the country, and the administration withdrew it and issued a second version in March of 2017. The second version was a little bit narrower than the first version because it did not apply to permanent residents of the United States.
Didn't they also add in a country that wasn't majority Muslim?
No, that was the third version. That was the third version, not in the second version. The second version, you still had Muslim-majority countries, but it didn't apply to people who were permanent residents of the United States, and there was an explicit preference for Christians coming from the banned countries, which was removed from the second version of the order. But it was, very similar to the first version, and it was again challenged in the courts, and it was again enjoined by the courts. The courts then were proceeding to litigate this issue further, and the government went to the Supreme Court and said, hey, we've got an issue with this, and we want you to review the court decisions on the second version. So the court agreed to hear this, and oral arguments were scheduled for last fall. However, before oral arguments actually took place, the administration issued a third version of the ban. Now, this version was the one in which they sort of shuffled around the countries a little bit. So, for example, they took Iraq, which had previously been on the list, off the list, and they added Chad, which is also a Muslim-majority country. But they also added North Korea, which, as you know, sends a handful of people to the United States every year. So it's not a real
it's meaningless.
The scope of the ban. Yeah, it's window dressing. And then they added a few government officials from Venezuela. So they did add a couple of countries to the ban. They also kind of reframed the justification for the ban and said, hey, we've conducted this big interagency review, and these countries who we've banned from the United States actually aren't very good at sharing information with us. And that was the justification they put forward when they tried for the third time to institute this ban.
So what was the essence of the arguments yesterday, and how, I've heard that the hard right justices on the court seemed, in their interrogation of the attorneys, to be leaning to be more favorable toward keeping the ban, whereas the progressive justices were saying, no way. What's your sense of that, and is that accurate reporting?
Well, I think that, look, when you're talking about national security matters and foreign policy, you are naturally operating in a sphere where courts are more likely to defer to the executive, right? Because they think this is something that the president is better equipped to decide than we are. We don't want to interfere with his judgments. So you have this sort of generalized deference to the executive when you talk about national security matters, which is what this has been framed as. Now, that doesn't mean, of course, that courts have no role, and we have seen courts step forward from time to time in particularly egregious cases to restrict what the executive can and cannot do. And we saw that, for example, with some of the early Guantanamo cases, which went up to the Supreme Court back in the early 2000s. So a lot of this is about, well, how far is the court going to go in looking at what the president says are the national security justifications here. And the government relies very extensively on this interagency process that took place over the course of last summer into early fall. But I think that, at least some of the justices were quite skeptical of that. And I forget if it was Justice Kagan or Justice Sotomayor was like, well, if the interagency knows what outcome the president wants, what are the odds that they're going to come to a different result? And I think that's a really important part of this case. I think the second part of this case that's really important is how do you deal with, a president who has openly expressed hostility towards an entire faith and people of that faith, and then who, puts forward a policy that is facially targeted towards people of that faith. And again, one of the justices raised the question is, supposing you had a president who was a obvious and avowed anti-Semite, and he came into office and with the advice and consent of his cabinet decided to ban people from Israel from traveling to the United States. And I think that the government really struggled with that. hypothetical to justify that.
Yeah. So is it your sense that the Supreme Court is going to uphold the travel ban or strike it down?
I think we're going to have to wait and see. As in so many instances, it all depends on Justice Kennedy.
Oh, really? It's that the partisan divisions are that clear?
Well, I don't know if they're that clear, but I listened to the audio because I wasn't able to be there. But from what I could tell, I mean, the justices asked tough questions, and there are tough questions to be asked to both sides in this case. Yeah. But at the end of the day, I mean, I think there is a strong sense that certainly more of the liberal justices are likely to strike down the ban, and that the conservative justices are more likely to not strike it down. And you could attribute that to deference to national security judgments, right, which is again a sort of a long-standing thing that we've seen in the court, or B, sensitivity to discrimination, and both of those can work in different ways.
I would also attribute a hyper-partisanship on the court, which is, but anyway, Faiza Patel, thank you so much for being with us.
My pleasure.
The website is brennancenter.org.
This is the Thom Hartmann Program.
We'll be back with more of the news of the day. I want to talk about incels after this, and then your calls. Welcome back. Randy in Ottawa, Iowa. Hey, Randy, thanks for holding so long. What's on your mind? Thanks for watching Free Speech TV, too.
Hi, Tom. These aren't interesting times. These are infuriating times. Yeah. I'm going to change my initial comment, which was going to be on Greenspan and economics, to your answer to how are we going to change this corruption and money in politics. And one way is, can you hear me okay?
Just fine, Randy. Yeah.
Okay.
Is my voice coming back to you faint?
Yep, no, you're great. You're great. I have something in my earpieces.
I see.
At any rate, Bernie had a class last week for over 400, I think it was an online class for over 400 citizens who want to get involved in politics. It was kind of a starting point. And so that is one incremental step to fixing the problem. Now, this morning, there was a deal that on YouTube I was watching, and it was popped up. It was the Young Turks. And it was the Democrat, the name of it was Democratic Establishment is Clueless. And it was the Young Turks, and it was a very comprehensive look at what philosophies and what's going on inside the Democratic Party, and why they have a problem with winning, over the years. And my own personal thing is the Supreme Court, the Gorsuch seat. We should have been out in the streets, and the Democratic Party should have been infuriated, and Obama should have been infuriated and had his Democratic Party out marching in the streets.
Well, this kind of stuff comes from the top, Randy. Donald Trump is playing this well right now. He's stoking Republican rage, and frankly, I was so upset that Obama didn't do a more civilized version of the same thing when he was president. He just let them beat him up and never said anything. It was terrible.
Yeah, and well, I think that they're civilized people, these Democrats, but I think it boils down to some of them sleep in the same bed as the Republicans, and they're not quick to call them out. But I
don't think that's it. I think Obama is just not a street fighter, or was not. I mean, he was a brilliant politician, and he was a brilliant international statesman. I mean, he did so much stuff really well, but dealing with these punks and thugs coming out of the Republican Party, apparently he just wasn't ready for it.
I saw the big interview with Dan Rather the other night, and he's interviewing musicians now, and he interviewed John Mellencamp. And there were some things that I thought he was clueless on, but one of the things that came out of John Mellencamp was that if, you know, although he's got this heartland message in his songs and stuff like that, he is definitely anti-racism, and he came right out and said, he says, if they think I'm right-wing, I'm one of the biggest liberals going. And I told President Obama before he was elected that he was not liberal enough for me.
Wow.
So I don't know. It's one of those deals. Those are good interviews, and that Young Turks, the Democrats, what was it?
I'll have to check it out.
The Democratic establishment is clueless.
Yeah, and sadly they are. Randy, thank you. So the last thing I wanted to bring to your attention, I mentioned this briefly either yesterday or the day before, but we have this epidemic of right-wing crazies killing people, and nobody's talking about it in those terms. You've got these so-called incels, involuntarily celibate young white men, who are involuntarily celibate because no woman will hop into bed with them. They're unable to find a woman who will have sex with them, and so they want to kill women. I realize this sounds stupid and simplistic, but I am not making this up. There is this community of people, they call themselves incels. They've got a message board going, and this from Luke Barnes over at thinkprogress.org. The headline, Incels are wildly celebrating the Toronto van attack. The online community linked to, and the name of the guy who did the van attack, charged on Tuesday with 10 counts of first-degree murder, has been celebrating wildly in the wake of his alleged van attack in downtown Toronto. The group of misogynists who self-identify as involuntary celibates, or incels, have praised him, elevating him alongside the Santa Barbara shooter, and this is from 2 years ago, this guy, and the Las Vegas shooter, Stephen Paddock, two mass murderers who the community holds up as saints for killing, quote, normies, or normal people. They refer to sexually active men as Chad and sexually active women as Stacy. And a tweet from Archie Mann. Incels have a variety of means and tropes that they return to constantly, such as Stacy, attractive women who have sex, and Chad, attractive men who have sex. Non-incels are described as normies, and they're also derided. These are quotes from their message board. This random dude killed more people than the Supreme Gentleman, and he names the Santa Barbara murderer, says user Crustaceos on the incel forum, incels.me. I hope this guy wrote a manifesto because he could be our next new saint. Another user says, one celebratory beer for every victim who turns out to be a young woman between 18 and 35. And then they go into this conversation about, to quote Luke Barnes, debating new ways to bring terror to normies, including pipe bombs, acid attack, and mass rape. Young white men who can't find a woman to have sex with. Meanwhile, this Waffle House shooter, you're not getting this from the media. And I guarantee you, if these were left-wing attacks, they'd be all over this kind of stuff. Weird stuff about the attackers. Or even Muslim attackers, they'd be all over it. But the guy who shot up the Waffle House, and had that guy not stopped him, the hero of this thing, had he not stopped the shooter, he would have killed a whole bunch of people. He had an AR-15. He called himself a sovereign citizen. This is, Richard Mack's group, and he when he was first arrested at the White House, when they stopped him, he said, "I'm a sovereign citizen, and I've got business with Donald Trump." He's a Trump supporter and a so-called sovereign citizen. These are people who think that the government of the United States is illegitimate, and that they are the only real citizens, and they're claiming this. And another piece, this by Olivia Messer over at the Daily Beast. Accused Toronto killer praised woman-hating mass murderer moments before attack. The man suspected of mowing down pedestrians expressed his support, excuse me, just moments before the attack for a mass murderer who became a hero of the fringe men's right movement. This is strange stuff. Do you know anybody like this? I can't imagine. I just can't imagine. Anyhow, back to your calls. Cha in Wailuku, Hawaii. Hey, Cha, what's up?
Aloha, Tom. How are you doing?
I'm getting better day by day. What's on your mind?
That's good. I wanted to make a comment. You were talking about the Supreme Court and giving the rights to corporations. There's another insidious problem with that, is that it takes away the psyche or the soul from people and animals and plants. This is something that gets missed. You know, they can treat that trucker who almost froze to death as just another part of the truck instead of a person with a soul. This gets missed. I was wondering if you ever came across this.
I completely agree. And in fact, John Marshall, the second justice at the U.S. Supreme Court, he was appointed by John Adams on his way out of office in December or January of 1799. John Marshall said, a corporation is a soulless entity.
Beautiful.
I mean, he just laid it right out, right? That quote should have stood for the ages. As much as I disagree with John Marshall on things like Marbury versus Madison, and he was Jefferson's enemy. He was his second or third cousin, and they just did not like each other, which is why John Adams put him on the court. But he nailed it. And that was the prevailing sentiment back then, was corporations are not people, and we shouldn't pretend they are. Cha, thanks a lot for the call and for pointing that out. David in San Francisco. Hey, David, what's up?
Oh, hi, Tom. Yeah, it's a great topic. I'll tell you.
You're talking about the right-wing crazies?
Yeah, I've been calling you for, 15 years or something like that. And I think I've mentioned before that I came from a family, one of the founding fathers, John Hart of New Jersey, was, one of the signers of the Declaration. So we were always raised to understand that there were saboteurs who were built into America. The old aristocrats made a point to have their league put in positions of power. And they've been sitting here for 240 years, and with this kind of snide ruination of America's ability to run our own lives, and the idea that there are kids now raised without any kind of civics, without any appreciation for the idea, this kid to call himself a sovereign person, right?
Sovereign citizen. Yeah.
There were three catchphrases that made America strong, that brought us all together. It's united you stand, divided you fall. It's equal justice under the law, and it's taxation with representation. That we, the people, get to run our own lives, and we don't need some king or potentate or con artist to steal our tax money and drive us into the ground.
And all three of those have been usurped by corporate power.
Well, right, and so the whole idea is Citizens United is $1, one vote. Instead of one man, one vote, it's $1, one vote.
Right.
And millions are being spent on teaching kids that to not have an appreciation of being able to run our own lives. And so he even defies the very concept of a sovereign person.
I agree. David, thank you. And apparently the Republican in Arizona wouldn't have won without $1 million of outside right-wing money.
To the Thom Hartmann Program. Call 202-808-9925.
Back with more of your calls right after this. It's the Thom Hartmann University Book Club. Today we're reading from Daring Democracy by Francis Moore Lepay and Adam Eichen. This is from Chapter 1, What Will It Take? It's far too late and things are far too bad for pessimism, wrote author D. Hock in 1999, and we cheer in agreement. Yet we also know that in this treacherous time, it's really, really tough to stay true to this wise insight, and that's why we wrote this book. It's our way to find focus, energy, and honest hope.
What has helped a lot is one realization. Despite the repeated refrain to the contrary, Americans are not fundamentally a divided people. In the 2016 election, what drew many to Donald Trump was his pledge to side with regular folks against the elite populating the swamp. At the same time, one thing repelled many people from him was fear that he would instead fill the swamp, accelerating the corporate takeover of our democracy. Our point is that Americans who are typically portrayed as being far apart were actually seeking a similar change. In fact, poll after poll shows striking common ground in our values as well as our vision of the democracy we want. With one big exception, surveys of the super rich show a huge chasm between their hopes for our country's direction and that of the rest of us. Our book is about building on what most of us share so that we can transform fear into action together. Action strong enough to get at the very roots of our historic crisis, that of the degradation and assault on democracy itself. In our opening note, we recounted a bit of our separate journeys leading to our initial encounter in 2015 at the first global conference on money and politics in Mexico City. There we found ourselves surrounded by multitudes gathered from dozens of countries, all devoting their lives to one shared insight. Democracy is not a choice. Creating democracies truly accountable to their citizens is essential to our very survival, to the flourishing of societies supporting human life, and now, because of climate change, to the survival of the earth as we've inherited it. This is a colossal claim, we know, but there's one point in which human history makes us absolutely certain. It's not the magnitude of a challenge that crushes the human spirit. At our founding, farmers, shopkeepers, laborers, and slaves defeated an empire. Since then, black Americans risked their lives to fight against the subjugation of slavery and then for their democratic rights. Women fought for 7 decades to secure suffrage. In the 1930s, a democratic upsurge by workers led to the New Deal, which added basic protections of human dignity in the workplace and in old age. For millions, though, the promise of democracy remained unfulfilled. Soon thereafter, McCarthyism's witch hunts again dimmed our democracy, but brave Americans fought back. And by the 1960s, we began stepping up to halt an unwise war, demand civil rights protections, and embrace a war on poverty that by the early 70s had cut the poverty rate almost in half, lightning speed compared with the pace of most social change. Confronted with that which appears to be impossible, time and again, humanity has embraced the challenge with gusto, grit, and ultimately triumph. No, it's not a huge challenge that kills the spirit. What most defeats us is feeling useless, that we have nothing to say, nothing to contribute, that we don't count. A sense of futility is what destroys us. And it's precisely that emotional plague that today afflicts too many Americans across all political lines. Through our long social evolution, we humans have evolved as doers. We are problem solvers. If we were content to be whiners and couch potatoes, no doubt we could never have accomplished any of the human culture's vast achievements. Right now, though, many of us are filled with uncertainty about what to do, just as we most need all hands on deck. So we wrote this book in part to help ourselves and others to rethink core assumptions that disempower us, specifically about the meaning and power of democracy. Often we hear that seeing is believing, but for humans in many ways it's the other way around. Believing is seeing. No less than Albert Einstein explained, it is theory which decides what can be observed. If we do not believe in the possibility of genuine democracy, we will not be able to see signs of it emerging. So it's become ever clearer to us that the possibility of creating a flourishing democratic society rests on whether enough Americans believe that it's achievable. Certainly we do. Yet to take on any mammoth undertaking, a belief in possibility is but one ingredient. To jump in wholeheartedly, most of us also need to feel in our bones that success is essential and that there's a way for us to make a real difference. Applied to democracy, success depends, therefore, on whether we can embrace 3 simple but powerful ideas. 1, to fulfill every public need and to advance every public good, democracy is essential. None of our deepest needs can be served, nor are opportunities or threats met without it. 2, genuine democracy is possible. Here we mean real democracy, accountable to the people, not to narrow private interests. And 3, there is a rewarding, even exhilarating role for each of us in making democracy real. As we will show in this book, a bipartisan democracy movement is emerging that's not about dutiful do-gooding. It meets deep emotional needs, and maybe it's even what our founders meant by our right to the pursuit of happiness. These core tenets are not taken on faith. They become real for us as we've continually tested them against our lived experiences and in our ongoing study. In this book, we hope you will become a believer as well. When we assert that democracy is essential, we mean that it's not just a good thing. It's the only approach to governance that brings forth the best of who we are. It's a great book, Daring Democracy. Check it out. Welcome back. Thom Hartmann here with you and Barney in St. Clair Shores, Michigan. Hey, Barney. By the way, Barney, before you come on, I was looking at my Twitter feed here just a moment ago, and For American Values tweeted at MythSlasher is his or her Twitter handle. Tweeted, learn what the incels, these are the involuntarily celibate young white men, learn what the incels are thinking, and put in a link to a forum at incels.me, and was just looking through it. It's pretty startling stuff. Anyhow, you know, bunch of guys complaining about women who won't have sex with them, basically. Barney, thanks for listening to Sirius XM. What's on your mind today?
Hey, Tom. Very glad to hear that you're better. I was worried about you.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Listen, I'm sure this has probably already been mentioned already, but I had to say it. After the guy who shot up the mass murderer who shot up killed 4 people at Waffle House, what was his name?
I don't remember, and I am trying not to say the names of these people on the air because I think that that's what they want.
I agree completely. Anyway, you did know that after his first psychotic break with the White House and wanting to have business with Donald Trump, you know that of course his guns were taken away. And then his father gave them back to him. Right. And his father I think his father should be held equally responsible.
And he may well be. Certainly, if not in a criminal court, the families of the people who were shot have a strong civil case against the father in this case, in my opinion.
Yeah, and I'm sure they haven't given him any kind of psychological competency test yet, but was he? Do you know if he was technically found to be psychologically unfit once already, or
I don't know.
Do you have,
okay. I know that after the White House thing, he was supposed to get counseling. But this is the thing. Had he been Muslim, nobody would even be talking about whether he was mentally ill, because apparently Muslims don't get mental illness.
Right.
According to the media in the United States, if you're Muslim and you do these kind of crazy things, you're a terrorist. If you're white and you do these kind of crazy things, you're mentally ill. It's just that simple. And in fact, we saw this writ large a couple days ago when at first they thought that the Toronto mass murderer, this guy was an incel, an involuntary celibate, they thought that he was a Muslim. And the media for several hours, CNN, MSNBC, everybody were going off on this, it's another Muslim terrorist attack, what do we do, what do we do? And then they discovered that he wasn't. He wasn't a Muslim. And so then the narrative became, he's mentally ill. The guy's not mentally ill. He's an incel. He wants to kill women. And in fact, the majority of the people that he did kill with his car, including an 82-year-old grandmother, were women.
Yeah, exactly. And the mere fact that, put an S in front of Hitler, that's how I refer to the psychotic in the White House. The mere fact that he didn't mention the black man who saved who knows how many more people from being killed and attacked the Waffle House killer.
Right.
It never mentioned him.
Yeah, his name I'd like to remember. Was it John Shaw? No. What was his name? It'll come to me when I'm not trying to remember it. But anyhow, yeah, he deserves to be celebrated. Absolutely.
Oh, absolutely. And
he's an American hero.
And long story short, as far as you can lump them all in together, the hardcore right-wing, quote-unquote, Christian idiots, right. They should be considered terrorists too, because terrorism can take any form, written, verbal, non-communicated, behavioral. Terror can take any form. And the hardcore right-wing Christian faction, or wannabe Christians faction, they are also terrorists.
Yeah. I'm with you. And in fact, they're responsible for the majority of terror attacks since 9/11 in the United States, more than 65, more than 70%, I believe. And Muslims are responsible for a very, very small minority. Barney, thanks. Well said.
Laura in Palmyra, Pennsylvania. It says here you're running for Congress?
Yes. I'm running for the new 9th Congressional District. I don't know if you were following all that mess with redistricting
oh, yeah.
in Pennsylvania.
Yeah, we've been talking about it.
I was running in the old 15th, now I'm in the new 9th.
Have you gotten through your primary yet?
No. Primary's May 15th.
So tell us about
I have two, yeah. Well, what I'm calling in about was an experience I had last night. We had a forum with the 3 Democratic candidates and the 3 Republican candidates.
Presumably, you're one of the Democrats, right?
Yes, I am. Yes, okay. Yes, I am. And it was quite an eye-opening experience. First of all, it was sponsored by the Chamber of Commerce, and when the moderator was reading the questions, they were so weighted. He was talking about health care. He was talking about how Obamacare was a mess, and just everything was so weighted towards the right side of things, which was the other 2 Democrats and I were kind of rolling our eyes at each other every once in a while. We couldn't do too much because PCN was filming us, but what I wanted to call in mostly about were just the lies on the part of the Republican candidates about Iran. They were saying how Iran, the one man was saying he's a former CIA agent, how Iran is not living up to its side of the deal, and just how Obamacare is horrible, and just it was really eye-opening for me.
Yeah, it's really breathtaking, isn't it?
I can't believe that they're talking about these kind of things still today.
Yeah.
Because I've been kind of in a Democratic bubble.
Well, if you watch Fox News, you'll find that or listen to Right-Wing Hate Radio, you will find that this is pretty much all they've got. They're still running on Hillary hate. I mean, it's insane.
And Nancy Pelosi hate too.
Yeah.
That's
their big new thing now. Laura, if people want to learn more about your candidacy, do you have a website?
Yes, Quick for Congress, QUICKFOR Congress.com.
Quick for Congress. Okay.
Yep.
.com.
Yeah, thanks.
Sounds like a plan. Laura, good luck, and let us know how it works out. Okay.
I will do so.
Okay. Thank you very much. I appreciate the call. Dave in Federal Way, Washington. Hey, Dave, what's on your mind?
Hey, not too much, Tom. In the big context of my question, I'm still concerned about how the Trump administration and it looks like maybe General Mattis are still taking political advantage of this concept of, consequence-free push-button warfare. Mm-hmm. And what concerns me is, and it's not getting much attention, I don't know if you have an opinion on it, but apparently Russia has committed to giving the S-300 air defense weapon system to the Syrian regime. And I guess there's reports about under the cover of night meeting between the Israeli chief of staff, General Eisenkot, and General Votel, the CENTCOM commander of America. But what worries me about that is if they take some preemptive measures to keep those missiles from going to Syria, they might have to do it at sea. They might have to interdict Russian naval vessels en route. And I'm wondering if that concerns you, and do you see a possibility of this, of us stumbling and bumbling into a pretty serious war under this Trump administration?
It concerns me tremendously, Dave. And you've got a hard-right government in Saudi Arabia that wants us to go to war with Iran. And you've got a hard-right government in Israel that wants us to go to war with Iran. And I don't think the American people want to go to war with Iran, or frankly anybody else at this point, But we are being pushed so hard, and Congress is being lobbied. Both of these governments are spending money in the United States to influence our governments and our elected officials. And we know that the Republican Party, the more money you give them, the more likely they are to do exactly what you want. And money is just pouring into the Republican Party in particular, and that's why you've got all these Republican war hawks, like Mike Pompeo, who are saying, oh, the Iran deal sucks and all this stuff, which is really, the original the Iran deal sucks thing was about how dare Barack Obama have a foreign policy victory. We can't allow that. We've got to wipe off the history books, all successes of the Obama administration, period, recharacterize them as failures. That was their political strategy. Now that they have power, they're stuck with a pretty good deal that they had demonized, and they don't know what to do. And I think Macron is giving Trump a way out of this. I hope Trump is smart enough to take it. But the last thing that I think most Americans would like to see is for the United States to join with Israel and Saudi Arabia in a war against Iran.
Yeah, well, when you mentioned Macron earlier being maybe the next de Gaulle, I was thinking that exact thing, Tom. I was thinking, man, I hope so, and I hope he can be not only a hero to France, but maybe a hero to America as well.
Yeah.
And persuade this Trump administration that this perpetual war could escalate out of control, even beyond their safety, really.
Yeah, I agree. But let's also keep in mind that Macron is no liberal savior here. In fact, part of his speech to Congress was about how important the liberal order is, and by his use of that word, liberal trade policies, he was using that word in the European context, which means it doesn't mean what liberal means in the United States. It means unregulated. And in fact, I think he used the phrase deregulated capitalism or deregulated trade. He is, you know, he's to the right of the Republican. Well, he's not to the right of the Republican Party. He's to the right of Dwight Eisenhower. And he wants to be the guy running Europe. And then you got Theresa May and Angela Merkel has been moving to the right too. So and of course, you know, Poland and Hungary, Orban, and I forget the Polish guy, Siricki or whatever his name is, who's running Poland. You know, these governments are moving hard right. But, you know, yeah, we'll take our victories where we can get them. Dave, thanks a lot for the call, and thanks for listening to Sirius XM. Great to hear from you. We'll be back with more of your calls after this. It is coming up on 45 minutes past the hour. In fact, bing, we just hit it. And we'll be back with more of your calls. Anything on your mind, give us a shot. Stick around. We'll be right back.
You're listening to Thom Hartmann. Visit ThomHartmann.com for audio and video archives.
And we'll be right back with more of your calls. And welcome back, Claire in Poughkeepsie, New York. Hey, Claire, thanks for watching Free Speech TV. What's on your mind?
Hi, Tom. Thanks for taking my call.
Sure.
Well, since I've been on the phone listening, which is like my second time watching your show, and I so appreciate it because I'm a big Democrat, more ways than one. But anyway, what I want to say right now about the environment, I live on it's called Casper Creek, which goes into the Hudson River. I live in the town of Poughkeepsie, New York. And, of course, which goes into the Hudson River, which goes into the ocean. Right. My creek is dried up so much, and I've lived here since I was 8 years old. It's disgusting. I can't believe it. And another thing I want to say is every day I turn on the news in the morning to see if Melania has divorced Trump, and it's just a matter of time because this was in the beginning of the presidency, and now look at how much time has gone by.
Well, I think
I agree with everything you say. I'm a woman who grew up next to a black family. I love blacks. I love everybody, and I think everybody deserves a break, especially the Native American. And everything you said is right on spot.
Yeah, Claire, as a woman, I'm curious your perspective on Melania Trump. My thought has been, or what my observation has been, that she has kind of grown into the role of First Lady, and she's actually starting to relish it. She took responsibility for the state dinner and apparently did a very good job with it. And she's
her outfit was beautiful, even though it was French. But
yeah, from everything I've read, she's organized, she's thoughtful, she is detailed. She's apparently the smart one in that couple. And my guess is that she's going to stay with Trump as First Lady and enjoy that role and use it and not hold his hand unless she's forced to until the end of his presidency. And then the day after his presidency ends, she's going to point out that he violated her prenup with Stormy Daniels, and she's going to take him to the cleaners. What do you think?
Definitely. You're right. Stay in there, Melania. Take, not take physically, but like everything else, grab from everywhere and then divorce his butt afterwards. You're exactly right. I just want to say one other thing. I'm right down the road from FDR building, his library.
Yeah. Well, that's great.
So I'm in a good spot right here, and I'm very appreciative. Even though I'm disabled, I don't walk or stand, but I watch your program, and I'm so appreciative of it. keep on fighting the good fight, man.
I will do my best. Claire, thank you so much for the call and for your kind words. And
You're welcome.
Yeah, I appreciate it. And let's see here. Well, Irene, I'll pick up your call right after the break because we only have about 40 seconds here before we're going to hit the break. And just a heads up, in Australia, they are doing, and this is the 4th year in a row they've done this. They call it No Meat May. The whole month of May, across Australia, people are swearing off meat and dairy products. And they say that in No Meat May, if just 20% of Aussies participated, they would save over 124 million animals and over 430,000 tons of carbon dioxide in just that 1 month. It turns out that the leading cause of climate change in the world is not cars, it's not power plants, it's animal agriculture and producing massive amounts of carbon dioxide and methane. So, interesting stuff. We'll be back with more of your calls, Irene, Justin, and others, right after this. Stick around. It's coming up on 10 minutes before the hour. Welcome back. Irene in New York City. Hey, Irene, what's on your mind?
Hi, Tom. Good to hear you sounding better.
Thank you.
My topic's a little afield from some of the others, but I was inspired to call you about this because I have been concerned about this topic. A young man named Eric called earlier reading Macron's speech to Congress about how the United States really needs to see itself in the world, not isolated from it. And I think when you look at Trump, I don't think Trump has any belief system whatsoever. Trump is about Trump. So
I agree. He's entirely transactional.
Totally. He flip-flops based on who last had his ear.
Or what's in it for him.
Yes. But I am very, very worried about Stephen Miller and, by extension, Bannon. I call him Nosferatu, but he's also Machiavelli. And I think he is steering Trump to Trump's darkest impulses. I don't think he needs a lot of steering in that area. But Miller is not accountable to the American public. We can't vote for him. We can't protest him. But he's in there in the most private quarters of the administration, spewing his poison in, like that scene from Hamlet, into Hamlet's father's ear while he's sleeping, just pouring it in there. And mischief working on an already weak brain.
Yeah, and most people don't even know who he is, which is the bizarre part.
I just look at him and I get frightened.
Yeah. This was a guy who, as a high school student, was an anti-Semite and was going after, people of color and whatnot. I mean, he's got a long history of this.
Oh, yes. The janitor should be picking up after us.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. That was his, I shouldn't have to help clean up the school. Yeah.
Yeah. I think people aren't watching his influence enough. That's my fear.
Yeah.
He's kind of going under the radar, doing his thing in the back rooms of the White House.
Yeah.
But I think he's very damaging.
I agree, and I think he's the principal Trump whisperer. He's the guy behind the Muslim ban. In fact, I think he wrote the first one. And,
yes, you were just talking to Faiza Patel, and that's exactly what came to my mind.
Yeah. Yeah, excellent point, Irene. Thank you for the call, and thank you for making it. Very, very well said. Charles in Alamo, California. Hey, Charles, what's up?
Yes, to your point on animal agriculture.
Okay, for people who don't know what we're talking about, I pointed out during the break that in Australia, they're doing an annual, this is the 4th year in a row, doing an annual no meat May. So during the whole month of May, people don't eat meat. Now, the co-founder, Ryan Alexander, said that if only 20% of Aussies participated in No Meat May, they would collectively save 124 million animals and 430,000 tons of carbon dioxide in just that 1 month. Back to you.
Okay. Well, my point is that relative to the carbon dioxide emissions, animal dung makes excellent fertilizer.
It does.
And I have 3 farms in Nebraska, although I don't live there. And the possibility of using animal dung from the feedlot a ways away was brought up and lasted for a while. It also is possible to claim organically grown if you use that. And,
you can't call it organically if it comes from a factory farm, though, where they're using antibiotics and chemicals and hormones in their animals.
Excuse me, these are family farms, not factory farms.
Okay, thank you for the correction, Charles.
Yes, and
that's a whole different thing.
It's unique among the states that it doesn't allow corporations and farms like that. It's very good policy.
California?
Anyway, just because of lack of regulations and lack of policy, they started charging for the dung, and so the farmers, my farmers, shifted to the other and probably cheaper fertilizer, the nitrogen fertilizer. And I think that this is needless criticism. If we get our act together and decide that animal dung shall be placed in the ground.
Yeah. Well, Alice Avery pointed out that pastoral animals and things like this can actually be good for the environment. It's when we get into factory farming that it's so destructive. Charles, thanks for the call. Brenda in Hanover, Indiana. We just have a minute here left, Brenda. You had a quick comment?
Oh, I did, about one of the callers that came in when you were talking about...
about Melania?
Wife.
Yeah.
Yes.
Melania Trump.
And, oh, my God, I tell my husband. Anyway, I was listening to it, and I've thought this for a long time, like, why would she want to be married to him? I mean...
Well, apparently she was once asked... do you think that Trump just married you because of your looks? And her response was, no, actually, I've got the quote wrong. Never mind. Brenda, back to you. I'm sorry. My take on it is that she's going to sue him for divorce once she leaves the White House. I think she's enjoying being First Lady, and she's going to take him for everything he's got because he broke their prenup when he got it on with Stormy Daniels. Your thoughts, Brenda?
Well, I can see all of that she would ride that out, but I still have a real hard time with it because, I mean, why would she want to even ever want to be with someone like that?
Yeah, I mean, there are, I don't want to speculate on it, Brenda. I think, people should be allowed to have their relationships however they are and however strange they may seem from the outside. But this looks like it's going down in flames. Brenda, particularly when you look at it, check out the Stephen Colbert episode from last night. He highlighted Trump trying to hold Melania's hand, and she kept ignoring him and refusing to hold his hand. Brenda, thanks for the call. We'll be back tomorrow. In the meantime, don't forget, democracy requires you. It's not a spectator sport. Get out there, get active, tag. You're it. We'll see you tomorrow.
You've been listening to Thom Hartmann. For audio and video archives, visit thomhartmann.com.
The Thom Hartmann Program is brought to you in part by the Aiden Forecast, an investment newsletter with weekly updates of leading market indicators and a monthly deep dive into what the details of the economy and the markets mean for investors and retirees. On the web at aidenmarkets.com.
Wines have some of the highest pesticide levels in our food chain. This hour brought to you by ecowine.com. pesticide-free wines, organic wines, imported from France by the Organic Wine Company, ecowine.com.
The Thom Hartmann Program is brought to you in part by Super Beets. Super Beets are sourced from non-GMO beets, and they're packed with dietary nitrates, helping to produce nitric oxide for more energy, stamina, and support for healthy blood pressure levels naturally.
Call 800-568-9889 or go to tomsbeets.com. That's 800-568-9889, Tom's Beets, THOMSBEETS.com.